These lectures are titled Theories of Human Development, Part 2. The lecturer is Dr. Malcolm Watson. Dr. Watson is a professor of psychology and chair of the Social Science School Council at Brandeis University, where he has been teaching for over 25 years. He received his Ph.D. in developmental psychology at the University of Denver. Dr. Watson was also the recipient of the first Michael Laban-Walzer Award for Excellence in Teaching at Brandeis. Outside of his teaching, Dr. Watson is an active researcher. His areas of interest include the development of symbolic play in children, the development of drawing and art in children, children's understanding of family roles and family conflicts, and the causes of aggression and violence in children and adolescents. He has published numerous articles in journals and books and has also edited several books. His research has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Dr. Watson prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, a timeline, biographical notes, and a bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture.
Hello. In our last lecture, we introduced attachment theory. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about attachment theory in the next few lectures. And today, I'd like to talk about how nature works to ensure that attachments develop. And also introduce the theory of ethology, what that theory is all about, and explain how ethology theory was used to explain this process of attachment. And I'd like to particularly focus on the idea of innate releasing mechanisms, and I'll explain what those are, and then conclude with a romp through the course of development of the onset of attachment to show how these attachments get started from birth and in the first few years. As I mentioned, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth were the two people who jointly formulated attachment theory. We're mainly going to talk about John Bowlby's work today. When John Bowlby rejected the Freudian psychodynamic theory as an inadequate theory to explain how attachment develops, he turned instead to ethology theory. Now, ethology theory first emerged in the mid-20th century, and it emerged from the work of mainly from three European naturalists, Karl von Frisch, Nico Tinbergen, and Konrad Lorenz. Later on, they actually won a Nobel Prize for their work. Ethology theory is really a general approach to studying animal behavior. These folks were biologists, naturalists, but they studied behavior in animals and development of behaviors in animals that focused on the adaptive importance of particular behavior patterns. They were interested in the evolutionary significance of certain behaviors and how these behaviors then had evolved in a particular species. They carried out a lot of detailed systematic observations of different species, and they described how certain complex behaviors work to bring this adaptation about. They tried to explain why certain behaviors would have evolutionary significance. Certain complex action patterns that are often called instincts seem to accomplish this adaptation, and these instincts would kick in at critical periods in an individual's life. These are the ideas that came out of this ethology theory. A critical period is defined as a time in an individual's life in any given species in the course of this development when that individual is particularly sensitive to certain environmental cues and primed to respond to these environmental cues. If the individual is in that critical period and something happens in the environment, some signal is given, the individual will respond and will thus maybe develop a certain pattern and have a normal development. Outside of this critical period, either before it or after it, the individual may not respond the same way. So certain skills or reorganizations of the neural system are likely to occur in critical periods. The critical period primes that individual to develop or to have a neurological change. There's a prime example of this complex action pattern in a critical period that's seen in the idea of imprinting. Imprinting was first explained by Konrad Lorenz. He gave it the name. In imprinting, a newborn animal responds to the movements of another object or the features of another object in close proximity to that animal, and obviously has to form some kind of neurological connections or patterns of firing that now make the other object a preference and will keep the animal trying to seek the proximity of that other object or thing. If that sounds sort of vague, let me give you some specific examples in just a minute. Just let me mention, though, it happens in a critical period. If time passes and the critical period is gone, imprinting won't occur in animals. The imprinting, the connections have to be made during this period when it seems like through genetics this animal is predisposed to respond. Imprinting mainly took place in birds, although it can occur in other animals as well. And so when Lorenz studied it, he looked at ducks, geese, animals like that. When a duckling hatches, it will imprint on the first moving object of a certain size, usually about the size of the duck's mother. But any size, from a loaf of bread up to a small person. And what happens is when the duck hatches, at that point, there's a critical period in the duck's life, in the duckling's life. And the first moving object is what the duck responds to and then will follow and seek the proximity of that object. Now, normally, the first object would be the duck's mother. The eggs hatch, there's the mom, she walks around, and the ducks start to follow her, or the goslings, a goose mother. But the neat thing was that you could do this kind of experiment to show that it worked with other objects besides the mother. This was a way, by the way, that made sure that the child or the young in the species stuck with the mother. This imprinting was a way to make sure they were bonded and this attachment emerged and then continued. Let me give you an example of the kind of study that Lorenz did. He then took the eggs, had them hatch without the mother being present. And you could put something else there. You could have an artificially animated bread box and walk it around, and the ducklings or the goslings would follow the bread box. And the famous study that he did was he took the eggs, put them by himself. When they hatched, he crouched down and walked around, and the goslings followed him around. And there's some famous pictures, you may have seen one, of Konrad Lorenz walking around the yard doing his chores with this whole string of goslings following him around. He became their mother. Permanently bonded for the rest of their youth, if you will, their childhood, he was their mother. Now, ethologists believe that there are certain cues in a particular individual or object that then end up releasing these signals that, so that a person will then respond and imprint to this person. The cues may be colors or patterns or certain actions. And then whenever you see these signaling patterns, another individual will respond in a certain way. And he called these innate releasing mechanisms, these cues or patterns. So, movement in a mother duck is an innate releasing mechanism for the ducklings to follow the mother. But some of you may have seen on seagulls, different kinds of gulls, a red spot on the beak of the adult gulls. That red spot is an innate releasing mechanism, a signal to babies to peck at it. That part's built in. Some way they've evolved and they can't help themselves. When they see that red spot, they want to peck at it. And that pecking at it is then an innate releasing mechanism that signals the adult to open its beak. And so the mom or dad will open its beak. Now, typically, they've gone out and picked up a lot of food for the young. When the young sees the beak, she pecks at it. When she pecks at it, the mother or father opens the beak and the baby eats. So here's another form of an innate releasing mechanism. And there are several innate releasing mechanisms in primates as well that seem to elicit specific responses. So Bowlby theorized that there would also be innate releasing mechanisms in humans that would elicit attachment patterns, quite similar to the imprinting of a lower species. In humans, we don't have imprinting, and we don't have critical periods that are so absolutely set the way you find them in birds, for example. But he argued we do have something like imprinting that works in a similar way, and we do have something like critical periods. And most people agree. It's a little hazier for humans. We're not so locked into instincts, but there's something there. So there'd be some kind of mechanism that would elicit proximity seeking and then attachment formation in babies. They would respond to something the mother was doing, or some way, the way she looked. Now, by the way, I've mentioned this before, but when I use the word mother, I mean a parent or another caretaker, whoever is playing that parenting and mothering role. Babies respond to soft, warm things like skin and cloth. If you say, what are the innate releasing mechanisms in the mother or the parent that would elicit these kinds of behaviors from the babies? Softness, warmness, cloth. They cling and they grasp automatically. I don't think they can help themselves. Say, this is not a learned behavior. They come into the world doing this. And everything they do tends to indicate that they like this, that they prefer it, this kind of physical contact. In fact, there's a lot of work with other kinds of primates, with some kinds of monkeys and apes, who do the same thing. They tend to have a strong preference for what's called contact comfort and softness, and be able to cling to it. Babies also respond to faces. So faces are innate releasing mechanisms, signals that the baby likes these faces, they like to look at the faces, they particularly like eyes. And studies show that if you put different stimuli up for a baby to look at, babies will prefer a face over other kinds of stimuli. If you put a face up, they tend to look at the eyes more than anything else. Once they've developed at a certain level of the visual system that they can control their looking, it's really at about 7 to 8 weeks after birth. They like to make eye contact, or from the baby's standpoint, they like looking at faces, and they do make eye contact. What else do they respond to? Smiling. So smiling in the mother or in adults is an innate releasing mechanism to the baby. So after about 7 to 8 weeks of development, after birth, if you smile at a baby, it elicits an automatic smile back from the baby, and babies tend to like that and will look for smiling. And they quickly learn to try to elicit smiling. Babies also respond to the sound range of the human voice. So they like, if you give them sounds, they may like music, they may like other things, but what they particularly like are sounds in the range that the human voice is in, particularly female voices. So female voices tend to calm them. And some people have argued, well, they've been conditioned to this in utero. Maybe, maybe not. But they come into the world liking this level of sound. Let me give you a demonstration, or at least talk you through a demonstration. If you want to impress people with how good you are with babies, they have to be about 7 to 8 weeks of age. But sometime in there, you get a 2 or 3 month old baby. If you get down fairly close to the baby's face, and you bob up and down and move your face, and open your eyes really wide, and your mouth really wide, go, oh, babies will smile. And everybody will say, oh, you really have a good way with babies. But in fact, you are giving innate releasing mechanisms or signals that the baby can't help himself. He smiles. Okay? Because he sees that big face, he sees the big mouth moving, he sees the big eyes, he sees some of the movement. That's what they like. Now, reciprocally, there ought to be some releasing mechanisms in babies that would then turn on mothers and fathers because the attachment system is reciprocal. You remember last time we said that you want the baby to be attached to the mother, you want the mother to be attached to the baby, you want them both to stick together. And so we're all in the same species. You might expect that these releasing mechanisms are really going to be similar, parallel releasing mechanisms, and they are. So what do adults like in babies? Well, adults respond to the soft feel of babies. In particular, adults like it when a baby clings and grasps them. So no matter how hard and tough you think you are, most of us have this good feeling when a baby sort of molds herself to you and clings and sort of cuddles. And that feels good to people. Adults also like looking at the eyes of another person, particularly babies, but all of us like eyes. And we like to make eye contact with babies. It turns us on. And just as babies do, adults automatically respond to smiles. When somebody smiles at you, you usually smile back. And you really can't help yourself. In babies, we love it when they smile and we love it when they laugh. We find that rewarding. And I say that we do. This is not something that only certain people learn, like mothers. But in fact, older children respond the same way. Teenagers respond that way. Males respond that way. Females respond that way, whether you're a parent or not. Maybe not everyone in the world responds that way, but that's the tendency. Smiling seems to be a universal message. Regardless of culture, it doesn't matter where you come from. When somebody smiles at you, the message is, I like what's happening, keep it up. And we find that smile rewarding. Adults maybe like some sounds from babies, but they have one particular sound that they respond to, and it's a distressing, aversive sound. When babies cry, that's an innate releasing mechanism to adults. It's highly aversive and it's distressing. It's meant to be. It's almost impossible to ignore. We can try, but it's difficult. It's meant to be aversive. It's an innate releasing mechanism to get us to respond to the baby. Because like smiling, crying in humans conveys a universal message regardless of culture. And that message is, when somebody cries, the message is, I don't like what's happening, change things. And when we hear that in a baby, we have a tendency to want to respond. There's one set of innate releasing mechanisms that Konrad Lorenz argued elicit, in particular, nurturing behaviors in the fellow members of a particular species. And he called these releasing mechanisms, these features, this set of features, babyishness. And all animals that have an extended period of immaturity and parenting tend to have young offspring who don't look like the adults of the species, but have certain features that we'll say are babyish features. And of course, we have these babyish features in humans as well. So what are they? These features of babyshness, which remember are innate releasing mechanisms to bring people closer together. Oh, I have to say, I don't know where they started. The baby features are probably just some mechanical result of the way we develop physically. But the argument is that we have evolved, that when we see these features, we're drawn to them, we're attracted to them, and they release a certain kind of behavior pattern in us. So babies typically have very large heads in proportion to their total body size. A large head relative to the whole body is a babyish feature. They also have extra large eyes in proportion to their head. But before I sound like we're getting into the Little Red Riding Hood story, they don't have extra large teeth, for example, or extra large ears. They have large heads, large eyes. They also have a very large forehead in proportion to the whole head. If you look at a baby, the eyes, the features of the face are relatively low with a big head, big forehead up here. They tend to have soft, fatty, rounded, and non-angular features. So for example, they have a rounded chin, they have a small and rounded nose, they have large puffy cheeks with no visible cheekbones. They have soft, dimpled hands. They have limb joints with dimples and roundness. All of these things are babish features in humans. You can find some of these same babish features in other species. So in a lot of species, you can find rounded, non-angular muzzles, for example, on a cat or a dog. You can find large eyes, fat, round bodies. If you think of a little puppy with a fat, round tummy and non-angular, sort of short noses, some of the same features. But remember, they only appear in the species that have complex parenting behaviors. I keep going back to lizards as my extreme example. Lizards, when they're born, do not have babish features. They're small, but they look the same as adults. They're miniature adults. They have no babish features because they have no parenting. And there are other species like that. So whenever one perceives babish features in another person, the person feels this release of feelings of nurturance towards that other person. So the innate releasing mechanism is this set of features, and what it releases, the behavior it releases, is this feeling of wanting to protect, nurture, and take care of the other person. We can't help ourselves. We want to take care of people. We want to nurture people. We want to protect people who have babyish features, mainly babies. We can't help it. And in fact, it works across species at times. So you have humans who see a little puppy or a little kitten, and what do? They go, oh, she's so cute. Oh, they want to pet it and cuddle it and take care of it. Okay? And same with a cat, same with a gorilla baby. We usually don't hold them, but we see that and we have that same kind of reaction. Okay? We want to protect that person. Of course, it happens with human babies too. You see a baby, and the baby has a lot of these babish features. You go, at least in your mind, you go, oh, is your response. And this happens, again, in adolescence, in childless couples, in males and females, as well as parents. And so Bowlby argued it's an automatic response. We can't help ourselves. There's even some anecdotal evidence that it happens the opposite way across species. That, for example, dogs will sometimes be more tolerant of babies than they are of other adults, humans. Sometimes there's stories of dogs protecting babies or young children. There's the case recently of a little girl who fell in the gorilla area of a zoo, and the gorilla mother went over and protected her. It even works, and we've actually used it in this way, in dolls. If you think of how dolls work for little girls, for all of us, is dolls are made with babish features, extremely large heads relative to the body of a doll, extremely large eyes, rounded features, the kinds of things that will elicit nurturance and this reaction even from kids. It works with makeup. So for women, very often what they're doing when they wear makeup is emphasizing the babish features of their face. You maybe didn't realize you were doing this. You put makeup on your eyes to make the eyes look bigger and stand out relative to the size of your face. You put lipstick on in a way that make your lips look rounder and puffier. I don't think all makeup makes women look like a baby, and maybe not all of it's intended to, but there's a lot of makeup that makes women look more babyish, whether they realize that or not. Why would that be? Well, some people have argued it's stressing an innocence, a need to be protected, a need for nurturance. And in fact, in women, if you think about it, in some ways they have, on average, more babyish features than men, in the sense that they have less angular and more rounded features. Maybe one reason they get treated the way they do, in some small part. There's a social psychologist, Leslie Zebrowitz, who has even shown that these babyish features continue in our species. Maybe they're meant to have this response of mother to child, but we respond that way even adult to adult. So there have been many studies that Leslie Zebrowitz carried out to show that we respond to people who have baby faces or immature faces as adults in a different way than we respond to people who have mature faces. At least there's that tendency. We see people who have baby faces as being more innocent, more kind, more honest. Those are good features. But we also see them as being less competent, less responsible than mature-faced individuals. And these perceptions and biases are independent of the attractiveness of others. You can have two people that you rate them on attractiveness or sex appeal, and they could be equal. But you see these differences if one is more baby-faced than another. And in fact, the research has shown it influences slightly how we choose people for different positions of responsibility, how we choose jurors, how we decide guilt or innocence in court cases, how we choose partners for various activities. For example, in court cases, if in a criminal case, if someone is a defendant and has a baby face, that person is more likely to be found guilty of crimes of negligence when they didn't do what they were supposed to do, but less likely to be found guilty of crimes of premeditated, careful planning. It doesn't mean that this is the only thing that controls our behavior. It's just one slight tendency or push in that direction. So you can see that baby-facedness seems to be a strong part of the way we respond to others. This is across cultures, by the way, from people viewing individuals in another culture or another ethnic group. It seems to be there early on in babies, and it seems to last throughout life. And Bowlby argued this is one of the main features then that we use to bring us together, to bring babies and mothers together. So they want to be together and they have this closeness. Let me now shift for a minute and tell you about the normal course of development of these early attachments. I've given you this sort of background process that happens. There's some significant changes in the first few months, and they coincide with the onset of certain signaling behaviors and these releasing mechanisms that we've discussed. And they also show the reciprocal nature of attachment, that it's happening for both the parent and for the child. The parent's becoming attached to the baby at the same time the baby's becoming attached to the parent. In the first 3 weeks after birth, after a full-term birth, the baby emits some of these releasing mechanisms or behaviors. They grasp, they cling, they cuddle, they cry. They have some of the babyish features. Nevertheless, moms and parents usually report feeling exhausted and frustrated with their parenting. And one thing that seems to be missing in these first few weeks is the babies aren't smiling. They're not making eye contact. And they're not, they don't have the full-blown babyish features, the real pudginess and fatness often. In about 4 to 6 weeks, though, after birth, the baby's routine stabilizes. They're more predictable in what they're going to do, and the confidence of the mother increases when you talk to mothers and they talk about what's happening in their parenting behaviors. At about 7 to 8 weeks, there's a major shift in that a lot of the cortex now kicks in. It's a myelinization of neurons that now, a lot of the cortex can now fire that was not possible before about 7 weeks. They call it the 7-week shift. It seems to be a maturational process. It doesn't have much to do with the way a baby's treated or brought up. When this cortex kicks in, there are association areas that then allow voluntary kinds of behaviors. And after about 7 weeks, babies change. They start sleeping for longer periods of time. But the important changes for our discussion today is they start making clear eye contact. They'll track the eyes of the mom or of somebody else, and they start smiling. So you smile at a baby now, and the baby looks at you and smiles back. And surprise, surprise, 7 to 8 weeks, mothers report, this baby is a real person. I love this baby. So at the time that this happens from the baby, the mothers now get excited and life becomes better. They say, my baby's a real person, my baby knows me, he's a lot of fun. At about 3 to 4 months, turn-taking starts to kick in. It's a gradual process. That is, babies start listening and they play simple games like peekaboo. And at this time, the mother often starts reporting, I need this baby. I can't live without this baby. You could say, well, she's primed by culture to think that way. But now they report it. It's a gut feeling. At about 5 to 6 months, it's clear that babies now have specific preferences for only one or a very few other individuals. You could say they really have attached. They prefer you and they don't prefer you. And at 5 to 6 months you see that. And of course mothers tend to like that too. They've already said, I can't live without this baby. And then at starting at about 7 months and between 7 and about 12 months, two really significant behaviors appear in babies. First, most babies begin to show separation fear. That is, when the person that they are attached to leaves and is not present, they show extreme distress. They often cry, they cower, and they look for the attached person. They don't like it when the person is separated. And the second thing they do is they show stranger fear. So when a stranger comes into the room or comes near the baby freezes, watches the stranger very carefully, often hides behind the mother, sometimes cries. These two behaviors demonstrate an extreme discrimination and preference for a specific attached person. And mothers, even though they'll tell you, oh, I don't know why he's acting like that, I'm sorry, privately admit they love it because it says, my baby likes me more than she likes you. And that turns on mothers as well. We're now going to finish this discussion, but next time we will continue with a discussion of the development of attachments and how insecure and secure attachments develop and what they mean. Thank you. Hello. In our last lecture, we talked about the early development of attachment and some of the processes that lead to attachment. We particularly talked about the work and theorizing of John Bowlby. In this lecture, I want to discuss the development of secure and insecure attachments and talk about attachments when they do not work in an optimal fashion. And I'd like to talk about Ainsworth's classification of types of attachment and also discuss the results that occur when children have insecure attachments. Now, as we discussed in the last lecture, humans are predisposed to form strong parent-infant attachments. But according to Mary Ainsworth, secure attachments can also become insecure, or that is, some attachments may not work properly. And Mary Ainsworth thought that the primary reason for insecure attachments developing was because of the inconsistent care and interactions that parents showed to their children. You see, John Bowlby was the one that introduced ethology theory and had a view of attachments forming in sort of a lockstep, automatic way. Ainsworth had more of a view of the strong influence of individual differences from parents. And we're going to talk about that today. Let me begin by talking about some research that leads up to this view of positive and negative attachment, kinds of attachments forming. There was some early work by two researchers, Schaffer and Emerson, in which they simply did observations of attachments forming. They went into homes and observed kids interacting with their parents. They looked at what happened when you had stranger fear, when strangers entered. They looked at what happened during separation, when the mother or the father would leave. And they wanted to find out how these attachments would occur, more about this kind of process. What they discovered was, first, although a lot of kids develop one single strong attachment to one person, usually the mother, very often kids develop multiple attachments even from the beginning. So very often it's the case that a child forms a strong attachment to both the mother and the father at the same time, or maybe to the mother and an older sibling, or maybe to the mother and the uncle. And so different attachments can form early on. And the aspects that seem to really determine which people became the attached figures for babies were the aspects of how these people treated the babies. And what they found in their research was it wasn't dependent so much on which people did the caretaking for kids. That is, who fed the baby, who washed the baby, who put the baby to bed. What was really important were the interactions of who talked to the baby, who hugged the baby, who played with the little child, who laughed with the child. Very often it's one and the same person that does this. But for example, if in one family the mother does all the caretaking, washes, feeds, cleans, takes care of all the basic needs, spends more time with the baby, 90% of the time, the baby might become attached to the dad or somebody else in the family if that's the person that's showing more of the emotional, social interaction. So that aspect was very important. There are other researchers that also looked at the early relations between a parent and child and the interactions between them, and these interactions seem to have to do with the way attachments would form. Condon and Sander were two researchers that filmed babies right at birth. And what they found was, even at birth, babies begin coordinating what they do to sounds and eventually to the sights and actions of other people. So for example, if they played music for a newborn baby, the baby might listen, but the baby wouldn't coordinate his or her actions to that music. If they played human speech, human sounds for that baby, the baby would coordinate the movements, the turning, the actions in coordination with this human speech. In fact, even if you had nonsense, if you took human speech and parceled it up into making nonsense words or sentences, the baby would still respond. The baby would respond regardless of the language. You could take an American baby and play Chinese speech, and the baby would still respond. It was the human speech, that level, that tone, that the baby coordinated to. And this was at birth, for all intents and purposes, at birth. Dan Stern was another researcher who looked into the early interactions of babies to their parents or to other people. And he found that very early on, there was a turn-taking that started to develop. So that babies and moms start learning to take turns. Moms seem to do this automatically. They don't necessarily think about it, and the babies learn it pretty quickly. The mother will talk to the baby. The baby looks, pauses and looks. Then the mother will stop and pause, and the baby will do something. The mother will do some action. The baby will watch. Then the mother pauses, and the baby does something. So, for example, you say, "Hi, are we having a good day today?" to the baby. Baby's watching very carefully. And then mom stops, looks at the baby, and the baby goes, "Ah," and flails about, okay? And it's a turn-taking. And then also mothers start playing games with babies, and the early turn-taking games are like peekaboo, pat-a-cake, these things where, in peekaboo, where's the baby? Where's the baby? You put something up, like a cloth over the baby's head. Baby pauses. If you watch babies play this game, they're still, they don't say anything. Maybe there's heavy breathing because they're emotional, okay? Then you say, "Where's the baby?" And then you stop, and the baby rips off the cloth, and maybe goes, "Ah," and makes sound and flails about. Baby's turn. So right away, these Dan Stern and other researchers are showing that we start turn-taking, and turn-taking is learned extremely early. That's very handy later on in all social interactions that require turn-taking, and particularly in language communication. But it seems to be part of this early attachment process as well. Ken Kay did a wonderful experiment, I think, And I remember seeing the videotape showing this experiment. He set up a situation where he wanted mothers to teach their babies to do something. At least that's what he told them. In fact, hardly any mother could teach their babies to do this. The babies were only a few months old. But he really wanted to watch the way they interacted, the way they went about it. And what he had is he had a mother have the baby sit on her lap in front of a barrier. It was actually a transparent plexiglass barrier. He would have the mother get the baby interested in something, like a set of keys, and jiggle them around. And then put the keys behind the barrier, but the baby could see these keys. And the mother's job was to try to get the baby to learn to reach around the barrier to get the keys. To have to not go directly through it, but how you can reach around to get it. So mothers were really motivated to show how smart their babies were and try to get them to do this. Remember, almost no mothers got their babies at this young age to do this. What he was really interested in was the process, what they would do. And what he found again and again was mothers would first give the keys to the baby would play with them, mouth them, suck them, do these things, and then after a while stop. And as soon as the baby stopped, the mother would then take the keys and shake them or do something else. And then the baby would take over again. And eventually, the mother would put the keys behind the barrier. And the baby would get excited and bang on the barrier and try to get them, and of course couldn't get them. And then the mother would pause and do nothing while the baby was responding. When the baby stopped, and very often when they stopped, they would look back over at the mom. It's almost as if they were saying, I don't know what to do now, Mom, it's your turn. And then the mom would reach around and shake the keys, and the baby would go at it again. Or maybe the mom would pull them back and try to show the baby that they went around the barrier, put them a little closer, and then the baby would take a chance. But the point is, it was constant turn takings. Moms would wait while the baby practiced. Then the baby would pause and wait for the mom now to do something. And this seemed to be the interaction that was occurring. This give and take interaction then seems to be part of this process of learning to be attached, of becoming attached. In order to assess the types of attachment that formed, though, Mary Ainsworth developed a technique that she called the strange situation task. The strange situation sounds like a science fiction movie. If you recall, I mentioned that she did a lot of her work first in Uganda and then in Baltimore, and this is some of the research that she did, particularly in Baltimore. This was actually an experimental condition or task that was set up to elicit the kind of attachment, the style or type of attachment that babies would have. And it was a task that consisted of a series of events for the infant and the parent, usually the mother. I can't keep track of the exact order, but essentially what it is the infant is first placed in a room with the mother, and the two of them are there alone. They sort of get used to the room. A few toys, things to do in there. Then at one phase, the mother gets up and leaves the room. Now the mother's directed on what to do. And all this time they're either videotaping or observing what the infant does. At another phase, the mom returns. In another phase, the stranger enters. In another phase, the mother and the stranger are both present. In another phase, the mother leaves, then the stranger leaves. In effect, it's a series of events that they then observe the baby's reactions to separation from the mother, reactions to a stranger, and reactions to reunion to the mother. And they looked at certain patterns of distress that the infants would show upon separation from the mother and on encountering a stranger. But most importantly, they also looked for the patterns or the reactions of the infant upon reunion to the mother. The reunions were as important, if not more so, than what the babies did when moms left or when a stranger entered. They did extensive research with many, many families. And from this, Ainsworth classified the various patterns that she found in the strange situation task. And she came up with 3 main types of infant attachment. Now, as a caveat, it isn't the case that kids fall in only one type and they are lockstep in that type forever and ever, and they're not so separate. It's a gradual blending, if you will. Sometimes they might do a little of this type, sometimes a little bit of that type. But they were able to classify kids as to their predominant pattern or type of attachment. She had type A, type B, and type C. Type A, she called avoidant attachment. And by the way, these same labels are used today and in hundreds of studies using this kind of task. These labels and this kind of task has been used. The type A, or avoidant attachment, is in effect a case when the baby seems to ignore the mother, pretty much so, shows minimal distress when she leaves, and upon reunion, when she returns, avoids her. Does not seem to be too emotional. Does not seem to care whether she leaves. When she comes back, there isn't too much response. In fact, almost stays away, sometimes won't make eye contact. Now, this is an insecure attachment type, according to Ainsworth. The type B attachment she called secure attachment. And babies in this case showed a lot of distress when the mom left. They tried to seek her proximity and affection and her contact when she returned. They would rush to her. They shared their feelings easily, whether they were negative and they were upset or whether they were positive and they were happy. And they were easily comforted by the mother upon her return. So even though they were distressed, when mom returned, all was right with the world. The mothers comforted them, and now they were fine. And most children show this type. So if you look at any thousands of families, most kids are going to fall into this middle range. Type C, you could argue, is maybe at the other end. And type C, she called anxious ambivalent attachment or resistant attachment. It goes by two names: anxious ambivalent, my favorite name, or resistant attachment. And babies in this case, in the ambivalent case, seem to be ambivalent, seem to be inconsistent in the distress they show when they're separated and in their reunion responses. So upon reunion with the mother, they often move toward the mother, rush, and then back away. And they sometimes act like they're trying to punish the mother. They make approaches, they'll touch her, they'll get a hug, and then maybe they'll even hit her or look away or push off and try to get away. And some people have even pointed out, some people will recognize that times when they've left a baby, the baby's upset and they come in, they think, oh, my baby's trying to punish me. It's so upset that I left. If this is the predominant form, if this is what happens most of the time, they called this ambivalent, anxious ambivalent, and it was also an insecure attachment type. You see, for Ainsworth, except in rare cases, she didn't believe there were cases where a kid was not attached. Of course, there are. A child is left alone to fend for herself without any adults. But in most cases, she said, we're all attached. We can't help ourselves. It's the way we are as a species. We become attached. But some attachments are secure and strong, and some attachments are insecure. It's just different kinds of attachments. So Ainsworth was followed by many other researchers, some of them her students, who used this classification system and the strange situation task to indeed show that they exist, not just in her studies, but time and time again. And that that these types of attachments will predict different aspects of how the child develops, subsequent outcomes that occur because of these attachments. Mary Main, Deborah Vandell, and Easterbrooks are three researchers who come to mind who have done a lot of work on the effects of insecure and secure attachments. Children, here's just a sampling of the findings. Children who show very secure attachments to their parents, to their mother or their parents, as babies, are much more likely to show secure attachments to friends during the preschool years, and to have normal peer relationships or peer friendships. So kids that have early attachments that are in the secure pattern now form friendships pretty easily. Those that are in one of the two insecure patterns are more likely to have problems with peer relationships and forming friendships. So already we see a strong and important result of these kinds of attachment patterns. Children who show the insecure types of attachments also have more behavior problems when they enter school. They have more problems with teachers and getting along and following the rules. And this is especially true of the resistant or the ambivalent, anxious ambivalent attachment type. These kinds of kids seem to be having problems. And they argued it's at least predicted by attachment type. Whether this is the full cause, at least it's predicted. Children in the avoidant attachment type are more likely to show problems with depression and mood disorders. And so if you're in the avoidant attachment type as a baby, you're more likely to have mood disorders later on as you go through school and become an adolescent. Okay. Ainsworth, you could say, what are the reasons, the causes of forming secure or insecure attachments? And Ainsworth again argued that the main reason is insecure parent-child interactions. In fact, this puts the blame mainly on parents or on mothers. So this is a controversial point. But in her research and experience, this is what she argued happened. Let me now give you some research that was done to show how this inconsistent pattern, the processes that may occur, how this might lead to insecure attachments. And then we'll talk about the idea of whether this is really the cause or not. I'm going to talk about some research that was done by T. Barry Brazelton, a pediatrician, and Ed Tronick, a developmental psychology researcher, who both did studies related to what I'll call the stone-faced mothers, for lack of a better title for these kinds of studies. The argument here was that if mothers didn't respond to their babies, we talked about how they have to because of these built-in releasing mechanisms, but not all people have the same level of these releasing mechanisms. What if a mother or a father doesn't respond? The babies make the responses, but all the time they don't. Or they're really inconsistent in showing this response to babies. What would happen? Well, first, Ed Tronick set up a study to try to demonstrate this. Again, I've seen the videotapes of this, and it's quite compelling when you see it actually demonstrated. What he did is he had some mothers come in with their babies, with their little infant babies, a few months old, maybe 6, 7 months old. And he sat the infant in an infant seat in a situation to look at the mom. The mom would stand in front of the baby, and he would instruct the mother. He'd say, now what I want you to do is not act in your normal way. I want you to show no emotions or no response to this baby. In other words, I want you to have a stone face. Whatever that baby does of yours, you stand there. Don't smile, don't laugh, don't frown, no expression. Stone face. And then he videotaped the baby to see what the baby's response would be at the same time that he videotaped the moms to see what they were doing at this time. And what he found was this sequence of events for the babies. The babies would first look at the mother, who now came into view and stood there, and get really excited. These were babies who were attached to their mothers. These were normal babies, by the way, who were securely attached. And they would flail about and smile and go, ha, 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 and they were happy to see their moms. And mom would do nothing. Stone face. And the babies would pause. Remember the turn-taking I told you about. It was sort of a turn-taking, but mother doesn't respond. It's her turn and she does nothing. Babies would look at her. So they'd try harder. They'd do more exaggerated motions. Ha, ha, ha. They'd smile, they'd do everything, and they'd pause and wait. It's mom's turn, and she does nothing. And they would try harder again to get her to respond. And then after a while, they would try tricks that we'll call flirting, that I have a tendency to think that babies even have, and maybe we don't have to learn them. They're just part of our nature. they would turn away and look back sort of coyly and smile at the mother. And mothers wouldn't respond. It always worked in the past, and now it wasn't working. They would try everything. And after a while, when they left them in there, when I say after a while, after a few minutes of this, the babies would turn away and would not make eye contact with the mother. They wouldn't look at her. And once in a while, they might look back and even smile. And if she hadn't changed, they'd look away. And by the end of this study, they were looking away and they were slumped down in their seats. They would just sort of melt and slump into this infant seat. It got so bad they had to stop the study at this point because the mothers couldn't take it anymore. It got on the point of being abusive in their view to their children. It made them so sad. It looked like those babies were depressed, that something was wrong with them. And it happened within a matter of minutes. And so his argument was, what if this happens over and over again? If this is the way that parents respond or very often respond, let's say the mother's depressed or the mother has some kind of disorder, something's happening, and this is happening. By the way, remember how it's reciprocal? Moms had a hard time doing this study. Not only would they get upset at their babies looking like this, but when the babies would coyly look at them and smile and try to get them to smile, you'd see mothers who could hardly stand to keep the stone face. They'd be like this. They started to grin. They had a hard time following the directions. Barry Brazelton did a similar study, but this time in Nature. He found a case of he did a case study, in effect, of a mother who was blind, had a sighted child, baby, and seemed to be pretty well attached. And the father could see, and the baby seemed to be pretty well attached. But he filmed in detail the sequences that they would go through. And what he found in this filming was that the baby had learned to not make eye contact or facial contact with the mother. So the baby would not look at the mother's face and would look away. And yet they had a strong attachment because the mother compensated. She did a lot of rubbing and hugging and talking. And the baby was attached to her. And the baby would make normal eye contact with the father, but not with the mother. In this case, it was a normal attachment, but it was compensated by some of the other things. Okay, this is a case then to show maybe the processes that one might go through in developing insecure attachments. There's another case where you could talk about a natural example for insecure attachments. In preterm infants, babies are often born and without some of the releasing mechanisms we talked about, the full baby's features. They might be a little more skinny or shriveled up. They don't have quite the babyish features. They don't respond. Because they're delayed in development, they often don't show the eye contact, the smiling we talked about until a later age. And they're also less predictable. They're less stable as preterm infants. Their routines don't get stabilized as soon. And in fact, there is more of a problem of attachments forming to preterm infants, of stable, secure attachments. There's more likely to be insecure attachments. This is particularly true if you have an infant that had a lot of health problems and had to be hospitalized for some time after birth. And in fact, they found that the visiting patterns of the parents predicted whether secure attachments would form or problems would form. Parents who visited daily and spent a lot of time with their infants in the preterm nursery tended to do better. And parents that stayed away, often because it was so upsetting and because they didn't know how to respond, and they cared deeply, but they didn't visit and they didn't make this contact, often had more problems with insecure attachments later on. So what they found is that the babies who showed these patterns and the parents then who understood what was going on with preterm problems and could adjust or compensate or realize what was happening to them would do okay. And in fact, now then, when you have preterm infants, hospitals will encourage parents to take part in the care. So for example, Tiffany Field has found that if babies who are preterm are rubbed and rolled around, these little fragile looking babies, but if they're rubbed and rolled around, in fact, they'll increase significantly in body weight and in neurological development at a faster speed than those babies who don't have this kind of rubbing and treatment. It's changed in the way we look at our treatment of preterm infants. There's others who question whether the quality and the consistency of parenting, though, is a main cause of insecure attachments. So even though Ainsworth said it has to do with inconsistent parenting, might there not be some other reason for this as well? Do we have to blame the parents entirely? Well, the main other explanation that's given is an infant's innate temperament. It may have a lot to do with just an innate style of the infant on whether secure or insecure attachments form. Jerome Kagan is one researcher who found that babies are born with different styles or temperaments even at birth. And some kids have this extremely inhibited style. They're extra sensitive to stimulation from outside, but being extra sensitive, they tend to freeze up and be wary and cautious, especially to new aspects of their environment. Something happens, something comes into their view. They freeze, they look around, they can't function. Other infants are born with an extremely uninhibited or outgoing kind of temperament. Nothing phases them. They're not as sensitive to change, and nothing phases them. And most people are somewhere in between. In fact, what Kagan found was this inhibited temperament has a stable, lasting influence. Over time, these inhibited kids are more likely to become shy kids as preschoolers and school-age children. They're more likely to be kids who have problems with change and newness, novelty in their environment. Hill Goldsmith and others have taken this information and looked at attachment styles, and they have found that highly inhibited children are more likely to have the type C attachment style of being anxious, ambivalent, or resistant. For example, these children show more separation distress, stronger stranger fears than most other children. They have more difficult times with changes in the environment. Children who are extremely uninhibited, at the other extreme, are more likely to develop the type A attachment style of being avoidant, of not caring. So temperament from the child may determine the way they develop attachment, not so much the actual way that the parents treat the child. Kids are just born this way, and it's the luck of the draw, so to speak. And surprise, surprise, most kids are in between. Most researchers would now agree, though, it can't be one or the other. It's probably a combination of temperament style and also the way they're treated. Because one thing that temperament style does not do, it doesn't predict the kinds of problems that develop from these insecure attachments that you get just from insecure attachments. So it's probably some combination, and that's probably the best way that we should look at it at this time. Next time, we're going to talk about a further consequence of attachment style, and that is the relation of attachments to further relationships in adulthood. Thank you. Hello. In the last lecture, we discussed the influence of secure and insecure attachments on a child's development. Parent-infant attachments influence subsequent peer relations, but they also have an influence on relationships in adulthood. You may recall that back a few lectures, we talked about the various functions of this reciprocal attachment system, and one of the major functions is thought to be the influence on later relationships, future relationships, of early relationships. In other words, a healthy parent-infant attachment may make subsequent healthy relationships possible. So today we're going to discuss how these relations between early and later attachments come about and what the nuances of this approach is. And we'll conclude today with an evaluation of attachment theory. Last time we talked about some work mainly instilled by Ainsworth's theory and her research. Today we're going to switch back more to Bowlby's theory and what he gave us. Bowlby proposed that during the first 2 years of life, children develop an internal working model of each of their primary attachment relationships. And he called it an internal working model. What does this construct mean? Why would he give it this title? Let me break this down. It's internal because it's a mental representation. It's a mental representation that the child makes of the person to whom the child is attached, and also of the behaviors and the actions, the emotions that are involved in this relationship between this person, this attachment figure, and the child himself. It's a model because it's a prototype or a copy of the person and the relationship. It's a model or this copy to which the child can refer or think about. And it's considered a working model, the key word working here, for two reasons. First, it's constantly changing. It's under revision. Think of it as a work in progress. And second, it's constantly being used. It's constantly being used by the child who forms this model to refer to and use. So think of it as a person works with this model. Therefore, internal working models are what children develop and thought to develop when children are separated from the attached person. If we were never separated from the people we are attached to, we would probably never have to develop working models. If all of our needs were met instantaneously, we would never have to worry about it. But of course, that's never going to happen. When a child's secure base then is not available, the child's going to feel insecure. And so it helps to have some kind of reminder of that attached person. That person have that reminder being around to work sort of like a security blanket works for children. Now, if we think about this on the adult level, it will make sense what children are going through too. When we leave somebody that we're very close to, we go away on a trip, for example. We're going for some period of time. And we're attached to these people, we know we're going to miss them. Very often, we take something with us to remind us of this person. We carry around a picture of the person. We even take a piece of the person. I think more in old days, people would take a lock of hair or a piece of clothing, a woman's handkerchief. We also take things that might be valuable and remind us of this person or that belong to this person. And these are like our security blankets, but one thing that they do for us is remind us of this person, having her there or him there with us. Children are doing the same thing. But children develop the ability to use symbols and represent absent objects. Somewhere, generally in the second year of life, they get pretty good at this. And when they have this ability, they become more adept then at creating some internal security blanket, so to speak. Rather than having to carry around some external piece of the person or have the person there, they can carry around the person inside. When they develop this model or this representation of the person, they can have the person with them at all times. They don't need an external object. So the idea of an internal working model, even though it's a fancy term, is simply that the person has a representation of the attached figure and all that goes with that relationship, and can carry this around with her, and therefore always has a secure base. So now when the child is not with the mother, child's away at daycare, child still has a secure base. And that's the purpose, according to Bowlby, of the development of this internal working model that you think of as just this representation. And that's what we have throughout life. We can, throughout our life, carry around representations or models of other people. But there's a very important byproduct of this development of internal working models. And that is the model is around now to also become a model for subsequent relationships. So now, when a child encounters a new person, child's off at daycare now, and encounters a new peer, a new person, what does the child do? How does the child know how to behave? If the child likes a person and wants to form a relationship, what can she do? She needs something to guide her. She needs to know how to respond and react and interact, I should say, with another person. And by turning to her internal working model, she already has a model of what to do. This is the idea that Bowlby tried to present. This working model is dynamic and changeable. It isn't always static. So it started with a model from the earliest attachment relationships, but subsequent relationships can modify it. So a representation that you first had and developed as a baby with your parents, you now can carry around, but as you make new friends, peer relationships, that's going to modify your model. You've gained more experience, and you'll have other models, maybe several different kind of models, that you can combine and put together to use to give you information about how to interact with others. Freud, I want to switch now to another interesting point. Freud proposed a concept called transference. And transference occurs in Freudian terms when a person transfers representations and emotions related to one person onto a new person. So emotions from a relationship that one had with one's mother or father is now placed on a new person, such as one's spouse or the therapist. And for Freud, transference was extremely important as part of his therapy, in using this in therapy. But the point of transference that I want to focus on is how this concept may be related to Bowlby's internal working model. Because in a sense, the child transfers in an internal working model the experiences from the original attachment figure to the new person in simply trying to figure out how to deal with this new relationship. It's not surprising then that experiences that we've had in previous relationships now guide us in responding in new relationships. When Freud explained transference, it sounded sort of magical, but it's really not much. There's not much magical about it. It's simply a common occurrence that we use what we've learned before in our experiences in new situations, on new relationships. In Freudian terms, the idea of transference can happen in many situations. It can happen as you form new friendships, as you form new intimate relationships. It can happen in different kinds of relationships. You can transfer the parent-child relationship to a teacher-student relationship. You can transfer the parent-child relationship to a therapist-client or patient relationship. You can do many things. You can transfer your intimate spousal relationship to some other kind of relationship. Sometimes it gets you in trouble because they're not the same kinds of relationships. Other times it's a pretty good way to learn how to respond in new situations. The influence of an internal working model, then, just like transference in Freudian terms, extends beyond childhood. You see, adults use these representations of the parent-child relationship as the model to guide how they react later on with their own children. This was the point of Bowlby's internal working model as well. When you become a parent, it's the first time. Now, you may have taken a parenting class, but for those of us who've taken a parenting class and then become parents for the first time, we realize it doesn't quite cut it when you get to the real situation. What do? How do you behave? And the argument is, you have this internal working model and you start doing things as your parents related to you. And thus, surprise, surprise, you start repeating some of the same patterns of parenting that you experienced when you were a child. And you can repeat the positive, very effective, good things, and you can also repeat the negative, maladaptive ways of being a parent, depending on what you experienced. I have a very good friend who's a teacher, a school teacher, and he said one day he was on the playground and kids were driving him crazy that day, and he started to yell at some of them to get them to behave, and he says, as I was yelling at him, I heard my mother calling out to these kids. I looked around to see where she was, and I realized it was coming out of me. So we do repeat the things that we've learned already. People also use the representations of their parents in forming relationships with other people, not just parent to child, but in friendships or intimate relationships. So now you're in an intimate relationships. How do you behave? What do you do? And the argument goes that you can go back to your parent-child relationship, but now you've incorporated as part of this model the way your parents responded to each other. You look at how they responded as spouses, mom and dad, and use that from your model to learn or to gain experiences on how you would respond to somebody. So in this case, a man now might start responding to his wife or his partner the way his dad responded to his mother. And the same thing goes the opposite for a woman. There's a lot of recent research that provides evidence that there's a relation between the earliest attachments and subsequent attachments. This is the crux of this. If this is a good theory, if this really explains things, then it really should be these early relationships relating and influencing later relationships. So let me tell you about one set of studies to begin with. This was done by Everett Waters and several other colleagues. Everett Waters was a student of Mary Ainsworth. And he did something that we've been waiting for some time. This is a fairly recent study. People had not done longitudinal studies. They'd speculated about this, and they could even ask people about how things were when they were children with their own parents. But think about it. None of us can really remember what it was like when we were babies with our parents. So if you ask somebody to say, what was your relationship like with your parents? Most of the time, adults are talking about what it was like when they were teenagers. Maybe a little earlier, but they don't get the whole picture. When you do a retrospective study like that, you do have some problems. We needed a longitudinal study. But this is a fairly recent concept, and people hadn't done it. Everett Waters and his colleagues have now done this. What they did is they went back to the people who as kids, as babies, were interviewed using Ainsworth's strange situation task. And they looked at these same people who are now in their 20s, in their mid-20s approximately, and found enough of them, a whole slew of them, that they could actually assess their attachment styles now and what's going on in their life, and they have all of the actual data on the attachment types and patterns that they showed when they were babies. And what they found was from infancy to young adulthood, to people in their 20s, there's a fairly stable style of attachment. 72% of all of these people that they tested and interviewed continued to have the same either secure or insecure attachment styles in general. If you had a secure attachment style when you were a baby, you were more likely to have a secure attachment style now. And they had this same style with their own children, the way they responded to their own children, and also the way they responded to their spouses. 64% of them stayed in the exact category. If they were anxious ambivalent when they were babies, they had an attachment style with their kids that showed an anxious ambivalent style with their own kids. If they were avoidant as babies, they had an attachment style that showed that they were avoidant with their own kids. However, 72%, 64% isn't the entire sample. There are a lot of people who did not stay in the same attachment style, that switched. And so they wanted to try to understand which people would switch. And what they found was that the majority of people that switched from one attachment style as a baby to another attachment style as an adult had major stressful life events that would seem to be antecedents of these shifts. So for these people, there was a death of an attached figure when they were a child. There was a major illness in their life or in the lives of those important to them in their family. There was a divorce of the parents. There was severe child abuse. Something was going on. It wasn't a routine life, if you will. Some major stressful life events had occurred. And this was the case for most people that switched styles. So in fact, what they concluded was, you stay in the same style unless something comes along in your life that pushes you out of it and you switch. That seems a little general, but in fact, that's the best way of explaining it right now. Now, if you look at spousal relationships, not just parent relationships, a person who had an insecure attachment style with his own parents was much more likely to show jealousy and controlling behaviors with his or her spouse. If you were insecure as a baby, you were more likely to show high jealousy and more likely to be a control freak in your spousal relationship now. If, as a child, you showed a lot of derogation and anger towards your parents, you are more likely to show the same kind of derogation and anger towards your spouse. If you saw your parents as being very helpful and caregiving and care-seeking towards each other, saw their relationship of how they were to each other, you are more likely to be loving and show less jealousy and aggression towards your spouse in the current time. And you can also see some of these same parenting styles with their kids. I've already mentioned this, but if you had an avoidant style with your parents, you were more likely to be avoidant with your kids, or they were more likely to have an avoidant style to you as the parent, and so on. Now, there's actually several places in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that give quotes like this. I found this in Exodus chapter 34, verse 7. And the last part of that verse, there's an injunction of the consequences that happen from certain kinds of bad behavior. And it says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and upon the children's children, unto the third and to the fourth generation. Now it occurs to me that this statement may actually be a statement that reflects the natural order of things. That a natural consequence of whatever happens early on is passed on from generation to generation. It's not automatic, it doesn't mean that we're locked into this forever and ever, but it means certain problems that you had as a child, you are more likely to pass on. Good things are also passed on, and it may go from generation to generation. Let me now tell you about some other research that was done on early relationships to later relationships, and this is in the way of influences on romantic relationships. This research was done and started by Philip Shaver and Cindy Hazan. Phil Shaver and Cindy Hazan used Ainsworth's 3 attachment classifications types, once again, as a model to try to explain interaction styles that we find in romantic relationships. In young adults, their argument is that it would work for adults of any age. But remember, they went back to all of the literature on attachment to form this basis. Now, the way they assess what your intimate or romantic relationship style is now to ask a lot of questions that a person will then fill out. And these questions deal with different styles, and in the long run, what you end up getting from this person is strengths and weaknesses, which questions and you'd agree with, where you fall on these questions. And what you can do is then give somebody a rating or a score on each different attachment style. What they're really looking for is not absolutely one kind of style in a person, but the predominant style, even though we vary in relationships, the predominant style that we show. Let me read you some statements. This comes from Shaver and Hazan. I'm going to read you this statement. You think to yourself and then answer honestly. Do you agree with this statement? Does it apply to you specifically? Does this explain the way you are, or does it not fit in at all? Here's the first one. I am somewhat uncomfortable being close to others. I find it difficult to trust them completely, difficult to allow myself to depend on them. I am nervous when anyone gets too close, and often love partners want me to be more intimate than I feel comfortable being. You really agree with that for you? Does that fit you or not? Here's another one. I find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like. I often worry that my partner doesn't really love me or won't want to stay with me. I want to get very close to my partner, and this sometimes scares people away. Is that you? Here's a third one. I find it relatively easy to get close to others, and I'm comfortable depending on them. I don't often worry about being abandoned or about someone getting too close to me. Does this apply to you? Well, the first case really was based on an avoidant attachment style. The second case was based on an anxious ambivalent attachment style. The third case was based on a secure attachment style. So the way they translated these attachment types or styles for adult romantic relationships is the secure style shows really a balance between a need or preference for closeness and a need for autonomy. In some ways, it's reminiscent of Erikson's accomplishment of both a secure identity and a sense of intimacy. These people share feelings easily. They have little fear of abandonment. They find relationships easy. They tend to prefer, this is what Shaver and Lozano found in interviewing people who say that they agree with these statements, tend to prefer sexual relations as part of their commitment to another person. They like sex, but they like it in committed relationships. The anxious ambivalent style involves sort of an inconsistency of feelings towards another person. These people are often overly invested in the relationship, and thus they exhibit a lot of jealousy and a striving for control. They often fear autonomy, and they're fearful that the person will leave. They tend to have lower self-esteem when it comes to romantic relationships. They like physical contact, they report, but often have problems with actual sexual behavior. They often drive their partner away by smothering the partner or their inconsistency in behavior. And the avoidant style involves a focus on autonomy to the exclusion of closeness, if we're talking about both the connectedness, the independence that we had discussed earlier. These people don't share feelings easily. They experience repeated breakups and failed relationships. They experience less grief when they break up, yet they also report being lonelier. They tend to have more promiscuous sexual relationships. In other words, they have sex without commitment to a relationship. And in some ways, this style is reminiscent of Erikson's failed intimacy stage, in which a person experiences isolation, even though they have social relationships. Now, I realize this is sort of setting it as absolute. Like I said, people tend to sometimes waver. They tend to be in between. But Shaver and Hassan found that a lot of people have a more predominant style, a more modal style that they go to. And they found that young adults who rated their style of their current romantic relationships as being predominantly secure, also from the assessments they gave, reported all evidence that they had secure attachment styles with their own parents. They remembered their parents as being warm and affectionate, and that their current parenting to their own children, if they were married and had children, also tended to be sensitive and non-compulsive. Adults who rated their styles in their current romantic relationships as being predominantly anxious ambivalent reported having anxious ambivalent attachments to their own parents, and they remembered in particular their fathers as being unfair. And when they had children currently, their parenting style to their own children was somewhat compulsive. And adults who rated their current style as being predominantly avoidant reported, again, having avoidant attachments to their own parents, and they remembered their mothers as being cold and rejecting quite often. And when they were parents currently, they tended to be more rejecting in their relationships. Now, I have one caveat for these studies. It seems from several different pieces of research that this way of classifying a romantic style seems to hold up. But as of this time, we have not done longitudinal studies where we've really taken people that we know exactly what went on in their childhood and now rated it to their romantic styles in adulthood. These have only been retrospective studies. So we have to be very cautious about any causal effect of what happened earlier and its influence on later relationships. Let me now conclude by giving you a short critique of this theory of attachment. What are the good and the bad points as I see them? Well, most developmentalists today accept the attachment system. How it develops, how it functions, they essentially accept it as it was described by Bowlby and Ainsworth. Currently, there is a lot of research that's based on attachment theory or has been influenced by it. And there's strong empirical evidence for this process occurring in humans as Bowlby and Ainsworth theorized. It seems to be the modal way that we form relationships early on, and it seems to happen fairly automatically. The mechanisms laid out by this theory are certainly more precise in explaining the development of these relationships than the more general descriptions that Freud and Erikson gave us. And there seems to be increasing evidence for long-term positive and negative influences from secure and insecure first attachments. These attachment processes explain a lot of related behaviors, like homesickness, like how we stay attached to people even after we split up relationships. So very often, as Robert Wise pointed out, even if a marriage fails, we still are strongly attached to that person. We don't think we love the person anymore. We may be angry at the person, but we can still have a strong attachment staying over. And for some time, attachments end very slowly when we're strongly attached to a person. So there's a lot of research and ideas on how these relationships are related to attachment. Attachment theory has also been highly influential in changing policies. I've mentioned some of this as we go along. Things aren't the same now. Parents stay with their children in hospitals. In newborn nurseries, mothers stay with them. In newborn nurseries, mothers get to see their children, have them right after birth. This wasn't the case the way it was years ago. In preterm nurseries and for preterm infants, we changed the way we handle them and the amount of interaction that parents have with their children. So there are many different parent-child practices that have been influenced by this theory. But there are also some shortcomings to the theory. One of the main ones is it's still very much unclear what the causes of insecure attachments are. If you recall, Ainsworth tended to blame the inconsistency of parenting behaviors, but it's probably some very complex mix of that and the attributes of the child. Many see the construct of an internal working model as a strong control of future relationships as being metaphorical at best and in some ways misleading. A more parsimonious view that many people would take is it's simple. Why bring in an internal working model construct to explain it? Simply put, we gain experiences in everything we do in life, and when we have experiences or things we've learned in one situation, we apply them to future situations. So our first relationships were with our parents or our first attachment figures, and of course, that gives us experience and representations, it's true, that we then use in subsequent relationships. But think of it as a chaining effect. Our subsequent relationships now are changed and develop, and these, along with the first ones, influence the next set of relationships. All along the way, any relationship will give you experiences or representations that you use in subsequent relationships. Therefore, the first attachment relationships are important because they started things off, but they don't control everything. All relationships along the way are important. I think this is the main way to look at attachment theory and its value today. It seems to simplify an account of this process. It seems to help us to look for the mechanisms behind the process, and it seems to help us to predict future relationships. Though I think that it is far from over. If you want to talk about a working model, this is a working theory that probably will be changed by the current research that's being done. In our next lecture, we're going to shift to our fourth major theory, Bandura's theory of social learning. And we'll start that again next time. Thank you. Hello. In this lecture and in the next lecture, we're going to discuss the fourth theory in our sequence of theories about human development. This is Albert Bandura's theory of social learning. But before we talk about his theory, first I believe we need to discuss some basic principles of traditional learning theory. And after that, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background about Bandura and his history, and then we'll discuss his main theoretical concepts and some of his research. Albert Bandura's social learning theory was a modification of traditional learning theory. And traditional learning theory grew out of a behaviorist approach that, as you recall, was really started by John Watson and then was passed on to others. B.F. Skinner was one of the most important and main people in learning theory. Another one was Clark Hull, who influenced Bandura. So I would like to give you some basic premises of this traditional learning theory, because these are the aspects, the principles that then influenced Bandura. The basic model of a behaviorist or a learning tradition is what is often called an SR association. The S refers to stimulus and the R refers to response. And it's called an SR, or a stimulus response theory, because in this theory, the stimuli from the world and the responses or behaviors that the person emitted are what is important. And the internal aspects, what happens in the brain, is really not covered. The mind is really not looked at. The basic argument was, if A, the things from the world, leads to B, what happens in the brain, and B leads to C, the responses, the behaviors, then A leads to C. And we don't really have to worry exactly about the internal processes. We can't see them anyway. We'll get it wrong. All that an individual can do, all that it learns, is dependent on stimulus input in this model. The input coming in through the senses to the organism. A stimulus, this is the S, remember, is picked up by these senses. For example, we see an object such as a donut in our visual field. The stimulus then excites afferent neural pathways, that is, incoming neural pathways, that then take this information to the central nervous system in the brain, and it causes associative firing and neural connections in the brain. From there, a signal is sent out on efferent or outgoing neural pathways that are connected to only two types of places in the organism. First, a connection can be made to a muscle, causing the muscle to contract. Second, an efferent connection can be made to a gland, causing the gland to release hormones. And so the R, the response, everything we do is simply a combination of muscle contractions and hormone releases. So for example, we see the donut, and now, because of hormonal releases, we might get excited. We also salivate because of hormonal releases. And because of muscle contractions, we reach for the donut and we eat it. Reinforcement, this is a big idea in learning theory, can be defined simply as a positive or rewarding effect that is caused by the responses that we emit. And these positive effects then increase the likelihood that an organism will respond in the same way the next time that the same stimulus excites the neural system. Likewise, punishment just refers to a negative or aversive effect that's caused to certain responses and follows that same pathway. So for example, we've eaten our donut, and now if we feel full and we've gained a lot of sensory pleasure, that acts as a reinforcement for the behavioral response we went through of eating the donut. We're more likely to eat another one the next time we see one and it presents itself. But if we feel nauseous and vomit after eating the donut, it's going to be a punishment, and the next time we see a donut, we might be less likely to eat one. So when the association is made between a stimulus and a response, this association then, if it has rewarding results, causes the pathway to become stronger. and it's more likely that this response will occur in the future. And the stimulus-response connection will be repeated and will become habitual. Learning then can be defined as a change in this response rate. You see, in learning theory, they were trying to reduce things and try to explain them in some basic way. Most of learning theory and the research, the numerous studies that were elicited from learning theory, concern themselves with explaining the conditions and the patterns that would come with the basic model of S to R and how reinforcers create these learned habits or these pathways, and going into the details of how reinforcement works and under what conditions. Now, this approach has developed some very highly effective behavior modification techniques, some techniques to help change behaviors in others and also that we can even apply to ourselves that really work. If one considers this learning approach and also considers the basic mechanistic worldview or approach that we talked about earlier in these lectures, you should be able to see that learning theory really developed from this mechanistic view of the world. The organism waits to respond to stimuli from outside. Learning is explained by basic laws of association, but interestingly, the workings of the association areas of the brain or the mind are not considered to any great degree because the approach focuses on what comes in from outside in, not inside out. That's a basic mechanistic approach. Learning theory was also opposed to Freud's psychodynamic theory because in Freud's theory there was so much putative internal motivation and internal conflicts and mechanisms that learning theory couldn't get at. They wanted to stay with what was really observable. Learning theory thus became a theory of behavior, not a theory of cognition or intrinsic motivation. Also, learning theory does not consider the laws of learning to be any different for infants or children or adults or indeed for other animals. So the same principles seem to apply to all organisms, even across species. There are no stages of development that are theorized. This is not a stage theory. Now, with that background, I want to mention, Bandura was trained in this learning theory tradition. This is how he started. He was born in 1925 in Canada. He received his PhD degree in 1952 from the University of Iowa. And at that time, the University of Iowa was a hotbed of research and theorizing and important work being done in the learning tradition. He then became a professor at Stanford University, and he's still there today. Now, he expanded on the work of some others. In particular, two people named Miller and Dollard did some work in the early 40s, and in 1941 coined the term social learning theory. And Bandura worked with what they had already offered. But he added two crucial changes to this traditional learning theory, even to the social aspects of it. He explained that the mechanism of reinforcement could really be understood in terms of the expectancies that we process. At the time, I don't know if he would have defined it this way, but he really added a cognitive focus. He came along was a precursor to what will later be the cognitive revolution in the way we look at both development and all of psychology. He described also this primacy in humans, as opposed to lower animals, of an observational learning process that we learn through observing others and imitating them. And this is different for humans than for other animals. He separated this. So, first, let's turn to Bandura's view of expectancies, this first part that he added. Unlike most learning theorists, he discussed this process that occurred within the brain to change behavior. The new emphasis for him was on internal processes. So again, he added this cognitive focus to behaviorism. And in fact, at the time that he came up with his social learning theory, and for some time afterwards, the extreme behaviorists rejected his theory and did not like it because of where he was going with it. He said, when a rewarding outcome occurs, this outcome that will become a reinforcement, if you will, and it occurs after we have already emitted a response, a behavior, it can't possibly have any effect on the behavior that was just emitted. That's in the past. The only possible effect it can have is on the future. So you can't argue about reinforcements changing past behaviors. It's one's expectation of reward in the future, not past behavior per se, that actually changes or reinforces the response rate of the future. It's not the reinforcement you got, if you really want to be technical. It's what you believe, what you expect. And in order to have an expectancy of some outcome, you have to believe that there's some means and contingency, that when some response occurs to some particular condition or stimulus condition, there's also a particular effect that's going to occur. You have to see that as causal and related in some way. And these expected contingencies, and under what conditions that you expect them, these are the things that are learned. Does that seem different to you from what learning theory posited? Well, it's a subtle but I think important change. One need never really be reinforced, you see. One has only to believe that there's an expected contingency between a response and a reinforcement to act. You can be right or wrong. You don't really have to have all of this experience, this conditioning. Learning causal relations is also an important cognitive process. It isn't a mindless reflex, if you look at Bandura's approach. So, for example, you may believe from past observations and experience, things that you've seen, that if you say please while you're asking somebody to give you something, you're more likely to have the person give you what you want. You may have never done it before. In fact, it may not work, but you believe it does. And so you're more likely to say please when the situation arises and you want something, because you're going to act according to what you believe. Now, my guess is if you say please, you are more likely to get a better response and people will help you out. But you could believe something that may actually not be true, but it's what you believe that counts. So the focus is on the contingency, the expectations that determine the outcomes. Okay. And along with this belief in expectations and contingencies, Bandura discovered a very important process he called vicarious reinforcement. See, even if a person were never reinforced, ever, for emitting a particular response or performing a particular behavior, that person might increase the rate of responding in a particular way simply because she's seen others being reinforced for responding in that way. So, we don't ever have to be reinforced to experience the effects of reinforcement. That's the change that he made. We might expect a contingency, but we don't have to experience it firsthand. This is a learned contingency by observing others, therefore it's social. You can see why this is social learning. It's called vicarious reinforcement because it only happens to a person vicariously, not directly. We're reinforced, if you will, vicariously, but not in real life. Let me give you a real life case. This happened just recently on my son's playground. There were some problems with bullying. And some of the older kids were really picking on some younger kids. Now, they had been taught in this school to go contact an adult, and the adult would take care of things. They had a, quote, a zero tolerance view of aggression. But they had a playground monitor, one adult, who did not really follow that approach. She was from an old school. And the old school was, boys will be boys, and you have to learn to work out your own problems. So when some little kids went to her to complain about the bullying they'd received, and the other kids were there, the kids that had been picking on them, and a lot of other kids were also hanging out, the teacher said, come on, you kids, you have to work it out for yourself. Guess what happened? Bullying increased significantly. Why? Because the kids observed the adult interacting with these other kids. They learned the expected contingencies. And now kids who had not been bullies previously started picking on other kids. And the bullies started doing even more of it. the contingencies were learned. Vicarious reinforcement explains many conditions in which humans learn new behaviors or change the response rates for old behaviors, even though they're never directly rewarded or punished for these behaviors. And vicarious reinforcement also assumes some complex cognitive processing. For example, you have to see a similarity of yourself to the other person you're observing to believe that the contingency occurs not only for that person, but it's also valid for yourself. So you could argue that this is a precursor to seeing that children need to develop some level of perspective taking, of being to see the connections, the cognitive connections, if you will, between how they do things and the viewpoint of how others do things. This came along before Piaget's theory influenced others in this country, but perspective taking would be arguably necessary to be able to see these kinds of contingencies, to use them effectively. Now, Bandura's other major contribution, besides this idea of expectancy, which led to vicarious reinforcement, was the observation that much of what we learn, even as young children, comes not in situations in which we are rewarded or reinforced or punished for responding in a particular way, but under conditions that we observe others. It's certainly related. We don't learn just from repeated trial and error, but in cases where we simply observe others behaving and then we imitate or copy the behaviors that we've seen modeled or performed by another person. So in this case, the child is the imitator and the person that she observes is the model. And the strength of observational learning for humans, which you don't see in lower animals, is that a person can learn a new behavior with no previous trials. Learning theory focused on conditioning, how over a period of time you'd experience these reinforcements, and over a period of time you can set up these conditions and get somebody to change their behavior. Bandura came along and said, yeah, people walking around seeing all kinds of things. They learn just like that. Never have to try it. You learn all kinds of things that you've never even done just by observing them. So observational learning is efficient. It's powerful. It increases the rate and complexity of learning in humans far beyond levels of lower animals. For example, if you've ever tried to teach a kid to tie his shoe, it's very difficult to teach a kid to tie his shoe with giving him rewards or shaping him to do just the right moves. It's very difficult to teach a kid to tie a shoe by explaining. First you take this side, loop it over here, put it around here, slip it around here. Try to explain yourself the process of tying your shoe. But all you have to do is show him fairly slowly, a few times, and kids will get it. Relatively few times they'll get it. You don't even have to reinforce them so long as they have some kind of motivation, intrinsic motivation to learn it. All they have to do is observe it. Complex behaviors can be learned through observation and imitation that would take us a heck of a long time to condition through just using reinforcement. Okay? This depends on cognitive processing. Now, in cognitive processing and learning through observation, Bandura described a two-phase process for such learning. And the two phases he called acquisition and performance. Acquisition was really the learning phase, and he separated it from performance, which was what learning theorists had always talked about. So let me go back through these two processes. During the acquisition phase, a child needs to attend to a model. The child not only needs to attend to the model, to watch what's happening, the child needs some mechanism to encode the observed actions, to put these actions in his memory storage. You see, Bandura is getting more and more cognitive, talking about the internal processes. Bandura believed there are two main symbol systems that a person uses to encode the observed information. The first is imaging. We'll call it imaging. It's creating mental pictures of what one had observed. And the second is verbal encoding, or translating an observed action into some kind of linguistic narrative. Now, in today's work and research on cognitive processing, I think people would think this was very simplistic to just talk about verbal imaging and verbal encoding or imaging, pictorial imaging. Cognition and the way we encode things is probably a very complicated mixture. It involves other kinds of propositions, other kinds of symbol systems. But let's go with what Bandura had at the time. And before I go with it, let's be clear. When we have imaging, we do in fact use that from time to time. It may not be the only form we use, but we do it. If I said to you right now, picture the door to your house or your apartment. Now go to the doorknob. Can you see the doorknob? Go just to the right of the doorknob. Can you see what's there? You can do it, probably. Most of you can. If I say, picture a dog. Now picture that dog being a German Shepherd. What do the ears look like on that dog? Can you do it? And this is imaging. And we encode a lot of stuff this way. But we also use this linguistic or verbal encoding to a large extent. So as I'm driving someplace, very often I'm giving myself directions. I'm saying, see, go 4 lights. Okay, this is the first. Okay, this is the second. Okay, here we are. Now turn left, stay in the left-hand lane. Have you ever given yourself directions like that? All kinds of things. Give yourself directions. And very often you can encode what the process is or even think what you're doing by verbal encoding. So we do use both those forms. Let me tell you about an experiment. It's a very simple experiment that Bandura did to illustrate this kind of acquisition and encoding phase of learning in the sense of imitating or observing others. He randomly assigned a bunch of kids to one of 3 groups. By random assignment in an experiment, it means that there is no systematic bias. For all intents and purposes, the kids in each group were equally smart and equally motivated and equally functional. Because if you have a big group of kids, they basically get the same mixture in these groups. In this random assignment to these 3 groups, he had one group observe a model do something. And while they observed, he asked them to out loud verbally narrate what was happening. So they might say, now the model takes the block and sets it over here. Now the model does this. And they were supposed to talk out loud about what was happening and narrate it. In the second group, he had the model count by 2s or some kind of counting task that he wanted to be an interference. So part of their brain, if you will, has to focus on the task of counting, and part of it was observe the model, see what the model's doing. In the first task, he wanted a facilitation. He wanted to increase the encoding, if you will. In the second task, he wanted to interfere with it. And in the third task, he had a control condition. They just observed and did nothing. Then later on, he told all of these kids, very simply, do everything that the model did, and I'll give you a reward. You get these toys over here. You get these candies for how well you do. Some way you motivate kids to do it. That's a no-brainer. So the kids are going to do some kind of task that they found the model doing. It wasn't completely simple. It was a sequence of things. And guess what he found? Think about it. Easy. In the group that had been facilitated, that verbally narrated what had happened, in that group, they showed the most imitation, in fact, maximum imitation. They did everything that they observed the model do, for all intents and purposes. In the group that was the control condition, that observed but had done nothing, they showed the next most imitation of the model. And in the group that had counted and had an interference, they showed the least amount of imitation. That's a pretty simple experiment. But the argument he made was the acquisition phase, the ability to encode this information and learn it, depends on our symbolic processing. And you can either facilitate it or interfere, but this makes a difference. Now, according to Bandura, After you have an acquisition phase, and you've observed a behavior, then you have a performance phase. This is what all the behaviorists had been talking about. So you've encoded something, but you only will perform it if you've also encoded the expectation of contingencies for what you'll get for doing it, and if you see a situation as being appropriate, that these contingencies are in effect, that now's a good time to do it. So he argued that a person may have learned a behavior, but carry it around inside one's mind, having encoded it, and carry it around for a very long time. We have a lot of deferred imitation. We could carry it around for hours or days or years, and we'll never actually act on it. We'll never actually perform it, yet it's learned. It's available if we need it. So you may observe, a child may observe his mom and dad yelling and swearing at each other in a fight, and encode those behaviors, pay attention, and develop some belief about what will happen if he does those. This was a way that mom and dad solved their problems. And several days later, he's in an argument with his brother, and he starts yelling at him and swearing at him the same way he saw his parents do. And he does this much later. Okay. Let me tell you about another experiment that Bandura did to compare the acquisition and the performance phase. I think this is a very simple but clever and elegant experiment. Bandura again randomly assigned child subjects to one of these three conditions. In the first condition, the child saw a model being rewarded, being given something and praised by others for acting very aggressively. So this would be vicarious reinforcement, if you will. In the second condition, the child saw the model being punished for acting very aggressively. So somebody came in and yelled at the person and took something away. In the third condition, there was a control condition. The person acted really aggressively, but there was no reward, no punishment. And then afterward, the child was put into a room with the same materials, a Bobo doll, some stuff to be aggressive with, and just left there. Said, do what you want, play. And surprise, surprise, in the condition in which the kids had seen the model being rewarded, they showed a high level of aggression. In fact, maximum imitation of the aggression of the model. In the control condition, they showed a moderate level of aggression. And should this surprise you, in the punishment condition, they showed very little aggression, almost none. So in fact, there was vicarious reinforcement. They had learned the contingencies and were following these on what was appropriate. Now, the next part of the experiment is really, I think, the most interesting and most important. After all this was done, and you found these levels, depending on the vicarious reinforcement, then Bandura went back, and he asked all the children. He didn't reward them. He just said, we're trying to see if you really remember what the model did. Can you show me exactly what the model did? And he said this to all of the kids, and guess what? There were no differences. All of the kids now imitated everything the model did at the highest level, regardless of the reinforcement condition they had seen it. So the reinforcement was a contingency that they had encoded about what would happen to them if they did it. But they had acquired the behavior. In all conditions, they had encoded the behavior along with the reinforcement contingency. It was there, and they could do it. You see that difference? Now, why is that important? Because these principles of observational learning, then, are profoundly important when we look at certain behaviors that kids may pick up. And one of the main areas that Bandura looked at was aggression and how aggression develops in kids. He was one of the first people to really do a lot of strong studies on aggression. He was one of the first to do work on the effects of the media on violence on children, on the effects of TV on children. In the early 60s, he started doing some of this work. And this has been subsequently followed with work on both the positive aspects that children can gain and learn from observing TV and models on TV, as well as the negative aspects. But he found early on, through this approach that we talk about, that children, when they observe aggression in others, can sometimes simply learn new behaviors behaviors that they never had before. They get new ideas. And we see this sometimes nowadays in school shooters. Sometimes they can learn or have a facilitation of behaviors they already know, but make it easy because they see the contingencies on maybe when they'll get reinforced. Sometimes it will disinhibit them from performing something. And sometimes they simply become desensitized. They see something enough times that they no longer have an emotional reaction to it, like seeing violence and goriness. And they no longer are inhibited from doing it because it doesn't bother them the same way. Observing then media violence has all of these effects, and this research has shown that. Well, in our next lecture, we're going to continue with Bandura's theory. We're going to add a new twist that Bandura talked about, a twist to understanding intrinsic motivation, and that is the importance of this sense of self-efficacy. Thank you. Hello. In the last lecture, we discussed Albert Bandura's social learning theory and his conceptual contributions of expectancies and vicarious reinforcement and how they drove learning, and also the research he did regarding observational learning. In this lecture, we're going to continue to discuss Bandura's work. We're going to discuss a related theory, self-efficacy theory, which takes the cognitive process of one's beliefs and expectations even a little further. We'll also discuss other related theories of self-efficacy to gain a fuller view of how this important concept fits into human nature. And then we're going to conclude with an evaluation of Bandura's theory. In the 1980s, Albert Bandura presented this second theory called self-efficacy theory. It's connected and I think complementary to his social learning theory. This theory had a substantial influence not only on researchers in child development, but particularly on researchers of adult development and aging as well. It's valuable across all ages, is not tied to any particular age. In this theory, Bandura became even more focused on internal cognitive processes in explaining learning and development. And by doing this, he further distanced himself from the classic learning theorists. Bandura is still a learning theorist, but he doesn't fit that classic mold. Now, what is self-efficacy? Self-efficacy can be defined as the belief that one has that that person can cause an effect on one's environment. The belief or the extent that a person believes that she or he is effective, that has an influence, and that's why it's called efficacy. A person's self-efficacy, in effect, is the way that a person perceives his own abilities and competence in dealing with various problems and challenges. A person can perceive his abilities in a particular domain to be very high and another domain to be very low. I can know that I am really good at skiing and really lousy at tennis. And so how a person sees his abilities will determine to which source he attributes success and failures. If he sees his abilities or his successes as coming from his own abilities, and if he sees his failures coming from his own abilities, he may see himself as not being very good. If he sees them coming from some other situation, and it's not his fault, then he'll still have maybe a high self-efficacy. So these attributions of success and failure and the beliefs that we have about our level of efficacy and how we can accomplish things will determine what kinds of tasks we'll try and what challenges we'll take on and what kinds of tasks or challenges we'll shy away from. So let me give you an example. If you are a man and you happen to believe that you have a high level of social skill, and you're extremely appealing to women, and you have a social skill in getting along with women, you might be more likely to approach women socially and with confidence and be rather assertive and outgoing in your initial social interactions with them. On the other hand, if you believe that your level of social skill and your appeal to the opposite sex is really quite low, then you're likely to be reluctant in approaching women socially, and you'll be sort of shy and non-assertive in your reactions and interactions with them. Now, we're likely, as I mentioned, to have different levels of self-efficacy for different skill domains. I mentioned skiing, tennis. We could talk about social interactions as an area of skill. We can talk about mathematics and music and so on. However, overall, we may develop a general level or sense of high self-efficacy based on the various experiences we've had, or we may overall develop some kind of low level of self-efficacy, or something in between. And so Bandura discussed an important concept to try to explain this self-efficacy and how it influences development and our learning. And he explained another concept that's intimately related to self-efficacy. This is the concept that he called reciprocal determinism. The idea of reciprocal determinism is that a person's skills and developmental level are not only determined by the environment and by others in the environment, but also that a person creates or determines her own environment by making modifications to it. So it's reciprocal, and it's determined reciprocally because not only does the environment influence you in how you develop and the skills that you develop, but in turn, you select the environment that you place yourself in. You change your environment, in effect. You only allow certain areas or certain things in the environment to affect you and not other things. This is important because it gets away from that purely reactive, passive view of humans, that the environment is out there doing things to you and molding you. You see, it goes both ways. It's an interaction. And whenever we think of the environment having an influence on us, as learning theory did, you can also think, yes, but we change our environment. We create the environment and allow it to have this influence on us. If you believe that you're going to fail at a certain task or in a certain social situation, what are you going to do? You're likely going to avoid that task and that social situation. If you think you're going to be successful at a particular task, you're likely to seek out that task and that social situation. This isn't always true, but I've generally observed that people really like what they're good at, and they keep doing the things they're good at. They don't tend to like what they're bad at, and they tend to avoid doing those kinds of tasks and being in those kinds of situations. So as you select a specific environment, then the tasks in turn will have an influence and help you to learn and develop. And you gain more experience in some areas than in other areas. You're likely to pick the environments that you already feel somewhat comfortable and competent in. Some people have a word for this. They call it niche picking. Isn't that clever? Okay, niche picking is you pick your niche, the one that you're comfortable in. So whenever you say, it's not my fault, I was forced into these situations in my environment, my friends did this to me. Remember, in this kind of reciprocal determinism, we also pick the environment and the niches. Now, this process of reciprocal determinism is greatly influenced by our sense of self-efficacy. Our sense of self-efficacy will increase or decrease in particular areas depending on the influences we have and the experiences we have from reciprocal determinism, but our sense of self-efficacy will determine what we pick. So this chaining of events creates what's called self-fulfilling prophecies. You may have heard that term before. The idea is whatever we believe will happen is then validated subsequently because we've brought about the situations that bring these beliefs and these predictions into fulfillment. So for example, if that person I told you about has this high sense of self-efficacy about his social skills and his appeal to the opposite sex, He'll place himself in situations where he gains a lot of practice at these skills. And he'll act as though these attributes are already present. And it's highly likely that he'll become the kind of person he already believes he was. And of course, this can work for people having negative self-efficacy and believing they're not good at something. Let me tell you about a piece of research that just recently came out that's quite interesting. This recent research showed that women, by the way, first, this was based on a view that women in general, we realize there's many exceptions, but women in general do worse than men on math tests. And the research showed that women do worse than men on math tests, but only when they are first told that the test assesses gender differences in math abilities. If you don't tell the people taking the test that this is what it's all about, they don't differ from men in how well they do on the test. But you see, if you tell them what it's about, that we're going to look for gender differences in these math abilities, I believe their beliefs about their self-efficacy cause this self-fulfilling prophecy. They lose their confidence. They think they're going to do worse. Voila, they do worse. Now, how does this sense of self-efficacy develop? Bandura believed that there are 4 primary sources of information or input that come into us that act as the mechanisms to either increase or decrease our sense of self-efficacy. First, and perhaps this is the most important, our own personal successes and failures change our self-efficacy through this process of reciprocal determinism that I've already talked about. In a sense, nothing succeeds like success. For example, if we constantly get high grades on a math exam, we come to believe that we have high math skills and we can take math exams with confidence. Now, the second mechanism or source is through observational learning, and we talked about that last time. In other words, we gain vicarious reinforcement. We see the successes and failures of other people whom we perceive to be similar to ourselves. And we think that these attributes that they have must also apply to ourselves. For example, if we see a person we identify as being successful at public speaking, we may think, I'm really a lot like that person, so I must have that same ability because we're a lot alike, and we're likely to imitate that person. So we see others as being, we talked about seeing others and seeing them being rewarded or punished as vicarious reinforcement. We also see others and see what they're good at and what they're bad at, and if we identify or see the similarities, we pick up these same things. The third source is what others say about us. What others say influences how we think about ourselves. That seems obvious. If they say something good about us, we tend to be influenced by it, or something bad about us. And also, it depends on whether they try to persuade us of the ability levels that we have. So, for example, if a child's teachers and a child's peers constantly tell him he's stupid at math, or they persuade him to work harder because he's failing, he will likely change his sense of self-efficacy about math skills to match what he's heard. And the fourth source of information that will change our self-efficacy is the emotional state and the physiological pain and pleasure that we feel internally in the context of performing some task. We have feedback from our own experiences. So, for example, if while giving a public talk, a person has really sweaty palms and a racing heart and feels lightheaded and nauseous, the person's likely to develop a lower sense of self-efficacy about his public speaking ability. He says, wow, under those conditions, everything's falling apart. Now, I think you can see that the idea of self-efficacy is a very important one because it will then influence where we go, the environments we pick, and what challenges we'll take. What we think we can do will become what we can do. There have been several other researchers who have developed theories of motivation that are very similar to Bandura's self-efficacy theory. And whenever I see a convergence of theorizing, a convergence of empirical evidence coming from different people that are more or less working independently, I think, wow, this is a good sign. This tends to strengthen, in my mind and in others, the validity of this conceptualization. There must be something to this idea because several different independent people are thinking about it and providing some evidence that it's working. So at this time, I think it's really worthwhile to mention some of these other related theories. They were smaller theories. They didn't involve, the entire field of development, but they were important. And one that I thought was extremely important was a theory that Robert White came up with in a classic paper written in 1959. He beat all the others to the punch, including Bandura. He wrote this influential paper that argued that when humans have met their basic needs, such as being fed, having food, having water, having rest, being the right temperature, not being too tired, when they've met these basic needs, they don't simply shut down like machines or like my dog. They don't function like lower animals. I'm going to drive you crazy with my lizards as my comparison. But when a lizard meets its basic needs, it goes to sleep. Goes into a coma almost. Okay. But when humans meet their basic needs, what happens? Think about it. You are not hungry, not thirsty, not too cold, not too hot, well rested, feeling very comfortable. What do? You're ready for action. You want something to happen. And White said we're very intrinsically motivated in these times to act on our world, to cause things to happen. Now, in humans, at least in our culture, and probably for a good share of human existence, these times are actually quite frequent. Most of the times, we're not in some crisis of meeting the basic needs. And so at these times, these frequent times, when we're doing okay, what do? We seek out challenging tasks. We want stimulation. We want excitement. We want to avoid boredom. Now, when we seek out challenges, ideally we seek out what's called optimal challenges, those challenges that are not too boring, not too easy in a task, and not way above us, out of our range. An optimal challenge is going to push us to the limit if we're going to be successful at this task. There's a chance of failure with an optimal challenge, but there's also a good chance that you can succeed. If you're playing tennis, an optimal challenge is picking out somebody who's about at your level, who it would be tough to beat, but of course you can beat that person once in a while. You don't want to play somebody who's well above your level, and you don't want to play somebody who's a beginner if you're somewhere in between. So you seek out these challenges, and when you're successful at meeting these challenges, you have this strong feeling or sense of efficacy, that you had an effect, that you caused something to happen, that you affected the environment, you accomplished this. And this sense of efficacy feels good. And this is the motivation that makes us want to strive to seek this kind of feeling quite often. In this process, we're more likely to develop mastery and competence in our lives because we're seeking out the things that will push us to our limits and help us to develop. So you're more likely to develop flexible, different skills because of this motivation. Now, White argued that this mastery or competence motivation, he called it mastery motivation, competence motivation, was highly adaptive. It's because of this that humans remain flexible, that they remain ever learning, they constantly try new tasks, they constantly try challenging tasks. They don't wait for a task to be absolutely required to do it. So, for example, we seek challenges at times when we're not required to perform something. In children, they do it in play all the time. They play because it can be stimulating and challenging, and they work out a lot of issues and learn a lot through their play. We do challenging tasks when we don't have deadlines, when we aren't being evaluated. The kinds of things that often happen in our jobs don't necessarily push us to be challenged. We engage in hobbies. We do crossword puzzles. We do things just for the fun of it. And these are the times where we'll take chances, where we'll take risks. And thus we become more creative and more flexible. It's our human nature to do so. I have to mention here that White also came from a Freudian background, as many of the other theorists we've talked about. He was a psychoanalyst, and he, like others, became disgruntled with the shortcomings of the Freudian psychoanalytic approach. And in trying to talk about this kind of motivation, why we do these kinds of things, he developed this view of mastery motivation to explain our creative, our playful, and our risk-taking nature. Susan Harder is another theorist who added to White's theory by giving examples of how one's history of successes and failures over time actually change a person's level of motivation to seek challenges or avoid them. White came along and said, we have this. It's built into the human nature. But this Harder, like Bandura, tried to talk about how it would change over time. Her view is such that, and she has several examples in research to show this, but basically the view is, over time, if we seek out a very challenging task and we're successful at it, again and again this happens, and also if we're rewarded by others for putting in an effort, for trying to seek challenging tasks, eventually these things cycle back and increase our motivation to seek out mastery. And I would argue our self-efficacy. On the other hand, if most of the time we fail at challenging tasks and we're actually punished for our initiatives, again and again this will cycle back and decrease our motivation to seek mastery and our self-efficacy. So it's our constant experience, one way, on one side or the other side, that will change this motivation. Martin Seligman was another person who developed a highly influential theory that's also related. His theory was a theory of learned helplessness. A person often learns to become helpless because of continuous experiences with failing at a task and not having the ability to affect a change in one's environment. Do these sound similar? White, Harder, Seligman, and of course Bandura. I think they're related. In this learned helplessness case, in a sense, a person tends to give up if she thinks she's helpless and to have any control. After a series of tasks that you can't solve, you don't try anymore. And in experiments that Seligman did with both dogs and with humans, he found that you could put somebody in a situation, give them a series of tasks that were really, unbeknownst to them, impossible to solve. And after a whole series of these tasks, then you would give this person a task that they in fact could solve, and they wouldn't even try. Another person who had been able to solve those tasks through working at them would try the new task. And so his argument is that in our real life we become helpless at times. And in fact, this relates in some ways to aging as well. Very often, older people believe they can't do something, and they learn to be helpless because of maybe some failures or some situations, and they quit trying to do the things that they can do in this theory. Now, a student of Seligman's was Carol Dweck, and Carol Dweck developed a theory that's related to learned helplessness. It's a theory about how we come to believe what our basic skills and abilities are, what the sources are to which we attribute our abilities. And she focused mainly on people's conceptions of their intelligence, but it relates the same way. Dweck showed that when a person primarily has experiences in which she's made to believe that she can change an attribute or ability because of her own efforts, she'll come to believe that this ability isn't a fixed amount. It isn't a particular level, that effort determines the skill level that she can develop. It's not something that you're born with. And in this case, a person's more likely to try harder after failures. Interesting. The effect of failures on somebody who believes that effort makes a difference and you can change an ability is to use those failures for feedback and try harder, and to accept challenges, to take risks. Even though you know you might fail, it gives you a chance to develop your skills. On the other hand, Dweck showed that when a person primarily has experiences in which he's been led to believe that an attribute or an ability has some fixed entity, that it's an amount within her, that it's inborn, then she comes to believe she can't change this skill level. And in this case, a person will be more likely to avoid challenging tasks, tasks that might show her to be incompetent, and she'll give up in the face of challenges. And she did research with students in schools and found that this was in fact the case. That if students believed that their intellectual level, for example, was what they were born with, intelligence is what you get at birth, then they didn't want to do tasks that might show them to be stupid. They would do tasks that they knew they could do well at, but they didn't want to let others see how stupid they were. If they believed intelligence isn't some fixed entity, but intelligence is just something you can get better and better at, or worse at, depending on how you do, they were more likely to take the challenging task because they wanted to get better at it. Yeah. Okay. Boys, by the way, tend to blame teachers for their problems, and girls tend to blame themselves more in intellectual tasks on this ability, and it seems to be related to the way teachers treat them. In general, at least in the school years, even though boys and girls don't differ in abilities, and even in the grades they get in the early school years, girls are treated as if you're really smart, and if you don't do this right, what's wrong? You should be able to do this. Boys are constantly told, you're lazy, you're just not careful, you're sloppy. And they tend to blame the teachers for criticizing them, and they get this view, I can try harder and I can make a difference. We need to now go to a review and an evaluation of Bandura's theory. You can see that in this part of it, there are a lot of theories that converge and seem to relate together. Let me now talk about which parts of the theory that Bandura contributed that are really good. And this is from the combined social learning theory and from his self-efficacy theory. As with a lot of these theories, you have to keep in mind what they contributed and what was around before the person came up with a theory and what's around today. Before Bandura, learning theory did not take account of cognitive processes, nor did it account for the great importance of observational learning that we talked about last time. Now, Bandura's theory is still mechanistic. It's grounded in behaviorist traditions of learning theory. But he added that cognitive focus, and he added, as we've seen with the self-efficacy theory, a focus on beliefs and about attributions and expectancies. And Bandura's theory has had a great impact on research in several areas. The development of aggression, we mentioned that. The development of phobias, how children, by observing others, learn when to be afraid and not to be afraid, just by observing others. On the lack of motivation to attempt tasks in older adults, when in fact they could do tasks, and come to believe because of their efficacy that they can't. He had a success on ways to deal with various kinds of problem behaviors and disorders. So in an applied sense, his theory has become very successful. It has a great record. Because he grounded the process of development in learning, he tended to equate development with learning. In his theory, it seems that all of development is simply what we've learned. Now, as a criticism, others would argue that because of that approach, he failed to explain some major reorganizations or structure in thinking and skills. He had a tendency to focus on the processes, not the stage-like changes or the structure. And the processes he discussed are worthwhile. He talked about vicarious reinforcement, observational learning, reciprocal determinism, but they function independently of the age of a person. And this approach has a tendency to treat children as miniature adults. They're less experienced, but they function the same way and with the same nature and the same internal processes that can be found in adults. Now, in some ways, this is true. But because of this lack of focus on the unique features of childhood, the way they may change from birth to maturity, a lot of people believe that social learning theory misses important aspects of development, and indeed of human nature. It falsely attributes some adult-like abilities to children that they don't possess at young ages. In Bandura's terms, any process you do, any of these things we've talked about, you could apply just as well to toddlers, school-age kids, adolescents, adults, older people. In some ways, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But as a compensation, I have to say, his theory does deal quite well with adulthood and aging, better than some of the other theories. We can ask again, why would an older person believe that he had little ability to do something? And Bandura's theory will explain it, and Bandura's theory will explain how he can learn from others. In our next lecture, we're going to shift gears. We're going to now talk about the fifth theory in our sequence, and that's Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Thank you. Hello. In this lecture, I'm going to give you an introduction to the fifth theory in our course, Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. And then we'll continue to discuss his theory in the next 3 lectures as well. I want to first discuss the context of the theories, the research that was going on in the United States when his theory came along. And then second, I'll discuss Piaget's history in the context of his ideas. And then we'll discuss his basic processes of development, the important ideas regarding schemes, assimilation and accommodation, and equilibration. In our discussion of Bandura's theory that we covered in the last 2 lectures, we got a hint of the changes that would revolutionize the study of psychology in general, including the study of human development. There was a shift in focus to internal cognitive processes. The shift brought about what's called the cognitive revolution. And Jean Piaget was one of the foremost theorists to help bring about this revolution. Now, from the 1920s through the 1940s in the United States, there was this fierce competition in psychology between Freudian theory and learning theory. Learning theory, remember, came from behaviorism. And these were 2 approaches to explaining psychological processes and change. But by the 1950s, behaviorism dominated the study of child development. It essentially consisted of the study of learning. Learning, development, it's exactly the same thing. However, then in the late 1950s and the 1960s, theorists in several fields, including Bandura, began focusing on important but neglected aspects of development, or the role of internal cognitive processes, and how these processes helped explain human learning. Although Piaget had been influencing European thinkers, his work had been written in French only, and so during this time period he had virtually no influence in the United States. Then some of his writings were translated from French into English, and a few developmental theorists in the United States, in particular John Flavel, began writing about his revolutionary theory of development. And this introduced him to American researchers, and it seemed to catch on right at a time, as I mentioned, when there was this cognitive revolution, when people were starting to look internally again and talk about how the mind worked. By the 1970s and the 1980s, Piaget's theory completely dominated the study of child development, influencing almost all of the questions, the issues that were studied, and all the research methods that were used. Never in the study of human development had there been such a complete paradigm shift. with such a complete revolution in the collective worldview. Essentially, the shift was from a mechanistic approach to an organismic approach, as we have talked about. And it was because of this cognitive revolution that learning theory dwindled in influence, just as Freud's theory had dwindled in influence earlier. Today, Piaget's theory has also dwindled in influence. But just as Freud's theory became an implicit part of our thinking, so is Piaget's. Thus, most people who study development today have internalized a lot of Piaget's ideas into their view of human nature and development. We can never go back. We have what he has given us. As with other theorists, Piaget's theory also was directly influenced by his own development in history. So let me give you his background and how he got to where he talked about his theory. Jean Piaget was born in Switzerland in 1896, and he died there in 1980. Even as a child, he had this strong interest in biology, particularly Darwinian evolution. As we know, that influenced practically everybody talking about theories of development. He was interested particularly in how various species change through adaptation to the various environmental conditions. When he was 10 years old, he published his first scientific article. It was about observations of a sparrow and the adaptations of a sparrow. He was very precocious, but I have to tell you, I read that article and it wasn't much of an article. Except that it was written by a 10-year-old, it was sort of impressive. Because of the influence of an uncle who was a philosopher, when Piaget was in his adolescence, he began to study philosophy. So he switched from biology to philosophy. He was particularly influenced by the field of epistemology, the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. Piaget more or less invented this new field that he called genetic epistemology. Think of genetic in the sense of genesis. Genetic epistemology for him was the study of the origins of knowledge, how we develop what we know. He rejected, however, this non-empirical armchair approach of the philosophers, and he attempted to combine philosophy with an empirical scientific approach, the approach of a naturalist in biology. As a biologist, he really took the form of a naturalist. He received his PhD in 1917 at the age of 21 from the University of Neuchâtel. And then he worked in Paris for a time on the development of intelligence tests. He worked with the group that was working on intelligence tests, the group that was started by Alfred Binet and his work. Now, although the purpose of this research was to develop norms and scoring for these test questions, Piaget got a little carried away. He became more interested in the errors that children made and how their errors seemed to fit specific patterns at different ages. Despite their craziness, he found method in what they said that was wrong, just as he found method in what they said that was correct. He discovered that children's thinking, even when it's not at the adult level, is nevertheless organized and has its own kind of logic. And so when they were giving questions on the tests, he would follow up. He would say, well, why did you say that? Or why do you think that's true? He probed and tried to get at children's actual understanding of what they said. And this was carried on in the rest of his work. In 1921, Piaget became the director in Geneva of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, connected with the University of Geneva, and he remained there for the rest of his life. Now, it was called the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, and it's no accident that this institute was named after Rousseau. Remember to our discussion earlier about Rousseau's philosophy and how it influenced people. No major theorist has followed Rousseau's philosophy of child development to the extent that Piaget did. Like Rousseau, he believed that children who were allowed to follow their own course of development would develop in a very optimal way. And he was an extreme organismic thinker. He looked at the human as an organism that acted on the world and didn't just passively react to the environment. Humans were organisms that functioned as a structural whole, in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. He believed that children went through a sequence of developmental reorganizations of their mental structures or a system of how they processed information. And so for Piaget, it was easy to think of development in terms of stages, and he was famous for his stages that we will talk about later. Piaget also turned out to be one of the keenest observers of children's behavior that we've had in the field. And because of this, he discovered important points about child development that others missed, though they observed children for millennia. Piaget came along and found these things that we've subsequently found to be true. When Einstein was living in Switzerland, when he was still in Switzerland, when he was doing his important work on the theories of relativity, Piaget and he became friends. And they used to have discussions about issues of how you know about the universe, of time and space and other things. And it's interesting that Piaget then tested some kids on these concepts. These were part of the things he tested about their understanding of knowledge. I think it's really interesting that Einstein said at one time, Piaget's a genius. Coming from Einstein, that was pretty good. For some of his most important work, he kept some detailed accounts of systematic observations of his own 3 children. And he did this over a period of years. It harkens back to the baby biographer approach to doing research. Actually, we've learned that his wife did a lot of those observations for him. Piaget didn't accept the basic behaviorist traditions of thinking, which were coming mainly from America, and remember, dominated thinking in American psychology. He believed that children should develop at their own rate and learn things for themselves, following Rousseau's philosophy, whereas behaviorism placed no emphasis on age or stage differences and believed that we could speed up development and make it more efficient with the appropriate conditioning techniques or environmental situations. Piaget thought that Americans were obsessed with speed. If something is good, let's do it faster. His answer to this American obsession with speeding up development was the following. He said this once: anything you tell a child, you prevent him from discovering for himself. You see, he believed that if a child developed more slowly and he thought things through on his own, in the long run, he'd develop more adaptive, scientific, and logical abilities rather than having people hand it out to him. You can see this, for example, in the way he talked to children. Once one of his children asked him, well, why do clouds move? I'm paraphrasing the way it went, but why do clouds move in the sky? You know what Piaget's answer was? Why do you think? And the kid would say something, and then he'd question that, sort of in a Socratic method. He'd keep questioning him. And he'd keep pushing this way and asking the kid, but he never told the kid what he thought. Well, after giving this background, now let me tell you about his theory. And what I want to do is start with the foundation of his theory, which is dependent on a basic developmental process that he believed was at work throughout our life. So even though he talks about shifts and stages of development, this basic process is part of our human nature. And these ideas actually came from his early work in biology. He thought this was a basically animal kind of approach. Here it is. Everything we know, everything we understand is filtered through our current frame of reference. We construct our knowledge based on what we already know. It's considered a constructionist approach. We can't know anything except by filtering it through our current frame, our current structure. And I want to give you an example of this. This is actually a quote from John Bransford, who is a cognitive psychologist and used this. I'm going to read you a statement here. You try to figure it out, what I'm talking about, what this refers to. Okay? The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange items into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to the lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity of this task in the immediate future, but then one never can tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, this is just a part of life. What am I talking about? Does this make any sense whatsoever, or is this complete gibberish? Now, if I had told you, I'm going to read you a statement about washing clothes, about laundry, would have made a difference. Let me start out again. This procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange items into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to the lack of facilities, that is the next step, and so on. You see, your frame of reference makes a difference. And this is a case where Piaget talked about we understand things by what we already know. That's the only way we get ahead, we adapt in the world. Piaget called this basic unit of understanding that we have, or the units of understanding, a schema or a scheme. Now, a scheme can be defined, it's sort of vague, but I hope by our examples it'll make sense. A scheme can be defined as a pattern of knowing something, the structured way that we have stored in our mind of how we recognize and act on and understand something. Schemes make up our frame of reference. Because we can't know anything without some structure, we have to be born with some schemes in order to get us started. So everything we know has to start with the schemes we're born with. We can't be complete blank slates, or we would get nowhere, in Piaget's view. 3 of the basic schemes that we're born with are really reflexive actions on how we deal with the world. Piaget talked about these a lot. They are looking, grasping, and sucking schemes. So a newborn's understanding of the world begins to emerge based on what she can look at, what she can grasp, and what she can suck. And she does these automatically and reflexively. They're very much action schemes. So what we call thinking starts with our actions on the world. However, we'd stay completely static in our development. We'd never really make much progress unless there's some process that allows us to expand and modify the schemes that we have to develop new schemes. Grasping, looking, sucking don't get us too far. And so this development is seen, in Piaget's view, to occur through 2 complementary processes. Both are important: assimilation and accommodation. He got these ideas from his biological background. First, let's talk about assimilation. Remember, we can only process what we already know, and this is the basic process of assimilation. We apply our current schemes to the new piece of information from the environment, and we incorporate this new information into our existing scheme. It helps maybe to think about the biological metaphor, the basis of this. If we eat something, we incorporate the new material into our body. We assimilate the food, making it a part of ourselves. And so this was the metaphor that Piaget used. A baby sucks what comes into his mouth. He knows a nipple by sucking it and by how it feels in his mouth. Now, if he then has a finger placed in his mouth, he applies his sucking scheme to the finger. If he can suck it the same way, it becomes known as a suckable object. What's a finger? A finger is this thing that feels a certain way, he sucks. That's what he starts with. An older child may have developed a scheme for a bird. It's a visual perception he has of this feathery little thing that flies around in trees, lands on the lawn. Now if he sees a large crow hop on the lawn and then it flies into a tree, he may apply his bird scheme to the crow. He can identify it as a bird as well by assimilating it through his bird scheme. However, all new information from the environment requires a person to constantly modify schemes because no 2 objects or situations are perfectly similar. So we have to constantly adjust our mouth to suck different things, like a finger versus a nipple. We have to look for similarities between a crow and a sparrow in order to apply the bird scheme. So assimilation requires a generalization. And in generalizing from one thing to another, we often overlook environmental differences. This point is that assimilation, by allowing us to generalize to a lot of different things, tends to distort reality. It would not be too adaptive alone because we give up too much. We distort reality to be able to do this. So what else is needed? Well, I'm going to talk about that complementary process called accommodation. The process of accommodation is the process of adjusting or modifying your current schemes to be able to handle the new incoming information, the changes in the object. So we have to adjust to reality rather than just distorting reality. Accommodation then allows us to modify our existing schemes so that they can be applied to more varied instances. Now, just like for Freud, everything was tied to sexual drives, for Piaget, almost everything's tied to intelligence and cognitive processes, even physical skills. He applies it to everything. Let me give you an example in one physical skill. A baseball player, let's say somebody's playing shortstop and they're fielding grounders. They have a fielding scheme. You can call it a skill or a habit they have of how you pick up grounders. But for every new grounder, which is unlike any other grounder in some ways, they have to accommodate to each new grounder and adjust. They apply or assimilate the grounder to their grounder fielding scheme, but they also have to adjust. Sometimes a piece of information or a new object is so different, though, that even though we try, we can't use our existing schemes. And accommodation also allows us to create new schemes based on the current schemes that we have. So we're constantly developing new schemes in his theory. So in the example above of the baby who's sucking things, she's going merrily around, she sucks nipples, she sucks fingers, she sucks some little toy, and she's trying everything. She's assimilating everything and sort of modifying and adjusting. And eventually she runs into a wall and she tries to suck the wall. But you can't suck a wall. Well, write that down. You can't suck a wall. To accommodate, in this case, she has to develop a new scheme. You can lick a wall. She might lick the wall. Okay. But it would be a new kind of scheme developed from the other one. In the other case of the older child who has this bird scheme, she's applying it to different kinds of birds. And let's say one day she sees a butterfly and she says, bird. But her mom says, no, that's not a bird, it's a butterfly. And she has to accommodate by developing a new scheme for butterflies because they act a little differently and look at it a little differently. So let me give you this summary now. Assimilation allows us to use what we know and understand already to make sense of the world, to generalize to new information. Accommodation allows us to modify what we know and expand our schemes so that we differentiate between different things in the world and adjust to reality rather than distorting it. It's what some people call a knowing circle. Constantly, we have our schemes, we have objects or things from the world, and we're constantly in this cycle of assimilating the world to our schemes, and at the same time, adjusting or modifying our schemes because of information from the world. And according to Piaget, even though I've given you some very simple examples like sucking, this process results in the development of innumerably complicated and interconnected schemes. And this makes up our mental structure, our understanding. By the time you get to be an adult, it's hard to think of individual schemes anymore. We have a very complicated structure now that we apply to the world. For Piaget, this process was truly an interaction between the organism and the environment. And they were constantly in interaction. It took into account the child's active reaching out to understand the world and the world's influence on the child. Now, Piaget's complementary processes of assimilation and accommodation comprise what he called the equilibration process. Fancy word for something that's really pretty simple. Piaget thought that the equilibration process was the most important process in development. According to him, by our nature as living organisms, we desire a sense of equilibrium. We're constantly motivated to find an equilibrium in different areas. And one of the areas that we want to find it is we're motivated to fully assimilate information and also fully accommodate information that we bring in through our senses or from objects or situations in the environment. And when we accomplish this, when there's a balance, but the balance really means full assimilation, full accommodation, then we reach a state of equilibrium. This is the equilibration process. The process of equilibration is essentially bringing assimilation and accommodation into balance. And for Piaget, this is also the process of intelligence. For Piaget, intelligence is not an amount, it's a process of adapting to the world. Whenever we reach a new level of equilibrium, though, we can't stay put for long, because each new level of understanding opens up new problems, new discoveries, so it's a constant dynamic process, it's not static. Our active nature, and also the constant influx of new information and challenges from the world, keep us developing and adapting throughout our lives. When we can't fully assimilate and accommodate, we feel off balance. And sometimes we actually feel emotionally upset. We're not very adaptive at those times. I'm going to give you one example of this. I have some friends who had a little girl who loved art, like a lot of little kids do. She did a lot of drawing, but she also liked looking at art books. And they decided, as a treat, they would take her to the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Now, some of you have been there. And this is sort of a strange museum if you think of a little girl going to this museum for the first time. It's around in circles. Usually you go to the top and you walk around this circle to come down. And so you don't really get the sense of floors. And also a lot of the paintings are placed off-center to the slope of the floor going down, but the paintings are horizontal to the ground, so it's a little off. Of course, it's a modern art museum. So a lot of the paintings that she saw were highly abstract. And partway through, she clutched her mom's hand really tightly, and then she started to cry, and she just fell apart. She went to her knees in this tantrum, crying. Her mother was panicked, wondered what was wrong. Some other people rushed over. And when they got her calmed down, she said, "I keep looking at all these pictures, and nobody will tell me what they mean." So this kind of disequilibrium, if you will, I think in her case, threw her into an emotional panic. It can have that effect. If you think about it, when you don't quite understand something, when you can't quite get things in balance, sometimes it's very disturbing. What happens, though, when we don't have a balance? It's interesting to look at this. When assimilation dominates and we do very little accommodating, we distort reality. Let me give you two examples. These are true stories. There was a mother once with a preschool kid, and she said, in talking to friends, "You know, tomorrow's a holiday. I think I'm going to take my son to the Children's Museum. We'll go visit there. He's never been there before." And her son was off with some other kids playing and being sort of noisy, and there was this pause of quiet. And pretty soon he came out to his mother crying. And he said, "Mommy, please don't take me to the Naughty Museum." What did he mean, the Naughty Museum? Well, here's what I think happened. He had this scheme for museums. Now, when you go to an art museum, what do you see? Art. When you go to the science museum, you see science. And she was going to take him to the Children's Museum. What do you see at children's museums? Children. He was a child, so his mother was going to take him there to see children, but he was a child. Maybe she was going to leave him there as an exhibit. But why would my mom ever do that? Well, it's punishment. I've been naughty, and by the way, this kid was naughty a lot. I knew him. And his assimilation, I think, was, I'm going to the Children's Museum to be left there, and it's interesting, when he set it back and was upset, he said, "Don't take me to the Naughty Museum." Now, let me give you another example. This was my son once, who, like a lot of little kids, when he was a preschooler, about 4, asked about the facts of life. We get a lot of funny stories about kids and the facts of life, because think about it, it's a fairly strange story. He said, we had some friends that were having a baby, or had a baby, and he said, "Dad, where do babies come from?" And trying to be a good modern parent, I tried to explain how they grow inside the mom, and then the mom goes to the hospital and doctors help it to come out, and all this information. He said, "No, what I want to know is how they get in there." So I proceeded to explain, and I tried to explain the whole process. I talked about penises and vaginas and eggs and sperm and the whole the whole schmear, the whole story here. And he looked a little glazed over, but I asked him, do you have any questions? He said no. I tried to explain it so he'd understand it. A few days later, he was in the backseat of the car with his mom and her friend. And her friend started to talk about how they had really tried to have a baby and it wasn't successful. She just couldn't get pregnant. They were thinking maybe they should adopt, and they started talking about this. And he said, Judy, I know how you can have a baby. And she said, how? He said, first the dad goes to the refrigerator and gets out an egg and puts it on his penis and then carries it into the mom. Where did I go wrong in explaining this? Well, think of it in Piaget's term. What happened here? As soon as I said the word egg, he used his egg scheme to assimilate this story. And for his egg scheme, as for most kids, there is one concept, there's one scheme, chicken eggs. And from then on, he had to adjust his story to this assimilation to his egg scheme. So here's a piece of very practical advice from this course. If you're going to explain the facts of life to a little kid, either don't use the word egg, or if you're going to use it, make it clear it's a very tiny little dot. You can't even see it. Okay? You have to make sure you tell them it's not a chicken egg to make this sense. That's assimilation that distorts reality. What about the other case, where you have accommodation that dominates and you do very little assimilating? Well, there was a girl once who thought she could tie her shoes, and she was imitating what her older brother did. And in fact, when you watched her, she looked just like a person tying her shoes. She would take her shoes, put them on, swish around the laces, and go like this. But there was no knot done. There was no tying. So often when we do blind imitation, we don't adapt to reality because we don't assimilate. We don't really understand what we're doing. We just blindly imitate in that way. These are two examples then of what happens when you don't bring things into equilibrium. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to continue with Piaget and talk about how equilibria, the formation of equilibria then, leads to the formation of Piaget's different stages. Thank you.